which is on the back of your workbooks. So we'll just take a little time, and we'll do this again at the beginning of our last session. So this session and next session, we'll take your questions. Does anybody have a question that's brave enough they want to raise their hand and ask from the floor, or you can text it in here?
You have one.
I've got one on my phone. So think about it. You want to read that one out?
This is a question for you.
Oh boy. Okay.
That's the really fun thing about question and answer. If I'm the reader, I get to decide who's the answerer.
Wait,
So,
I need to read that then.
This is a really good question. How do I let my husband's disinterest, or not let my husband's disinterest in our personal relationship affect the way I feel about myself? I feel I am not good enough. I am always put on the back burner. Kids, work, helping others always comes first.
Wow, that's a really good question. You know, I don't think we've ever gotten a question quite like that. That's a really good
No, but
one.
I'm guessing a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah. I don't think that's really a question for me, but I'll take a stab at it, and then you're going to fill in the blanks, aren't you? I think there's two things in this question that are helpful for us as a group. One is that we as men often feel like we're doing everything in our power to show love by doing, right? So we're busy doing all these good things, and what I just heard in that question is, it wasn't that he's not providing, he's not doing this, but that those things seem to come in front of personal connecting time. So how do you not take that personally? I don't know that it's entirely possible not to take that personally, but I think what you can do is to begin to choose to recognize the things that he's doing. Now, this wouldn't be true probably of everything that any of us are doing, but to choose to recognize the things that he's doing that are gifts of love and acts of service as a way for your husband to say, no, you do matter, and I'm showing you right now as I'm changing out your tires or cleaning your car or working extra time so that we can meet our financial obligations. I think you can choose to see that. But the other piece of it then is to begin to have the courage to communicate desire. So we have a whole weekend on anger and desire. That's not
It's
this
on
weekend.
YouTube if
It's
you're
on
interested.
YouTube. It's on the conference webpage. You can go look it up under family. Actually, the conference YouTube channel. Anger and desire. But there's something powerful, there's something very potent about looking your loved one in the eye and say, I appreciate all the things you do, but what I really, 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 really want most is you. I want to talk with you. I want you to listen to me. I want you to tell me about your day. And to communicate. And that's risky. That's really scary. That's why we're really bad at desire, most of us. Because risking desire is that whole naked and unashamed thing. It's the naked part of that. If I tell you my desire, I have just exposed myself, and you might not handle that well, and I might really, really regret that I communicated desire. But when we don't communicate desire, we become like the older brother in the prodigal son parable, and we become filled with bitterness and self-righteousness. And so desire is a powerful tool in unlocking new levels of relational intimacy because it draws people towards us when we risk in relationship.
I think that was a very good answer.
Yes.
Good job.
All right. I had a good answer. It's going to be a good afternoon.
It's going to be a great
Any other
afternoon.
questions?
Oh, wait. I was actually going to add to it if that's
Oh,
okay.
you're still. Oh, I thought that meant that was so good. There's nothing could be added.
You did a really good answer. I think the only thing I might add to that very good answer was that I think it's definitely important to communicate desire because sometimes we think we are communicating more than we really are. And I think there's something powerful about looking your beloved in the eyes and saying, my heart is for you and with you, and I so desire for us to be more. I mean, whether you're at a 3 and you want to go to a 4 on a 0 to 10 scale, or you're an 8, you want to go 9, there's always room for more. And I know I'm going to insert some things into the story that may or may not be accurate, but I know quite a few wives who have communicated such things in some way, and their husbands nod and go, and go, can we go back to the game now? And so when that happens, if that happens, and the words are not received in a way that brings any kind of movement, I think it's okay to start looking for ways that you can, in love, disrupt your current patterns. Because every relationship has its own dance. Well, if he does this and moves this way, I'm going to move this way. And the music starts playing, and we do this dance. And so and sometimes we need help, whether that be a wise friend or a counselor, mentor, that kind of thing, to help understand what our dance is, because it may need to be disrupted. Because if you're both, or one of you and the other is going with it, settling for the status quo, then it's going to be hard for there to be any relational movement. And like Richie said, if desire is building and there's no outlet for it, no communication, then it's very, very hard to not become bitter, and bitterness does not lead to oneness ever.
Go ahead, finish your thought. I thought you were done.
I'm done.
Okay. So I was just thinking as you were talking, as we've traveled and shared this seminar and other stuff, we've had a lot of conversations where someone will come up to us and say, so my spouse doesn't think there's anything wrong with our marriage. Is there anything that I can do if I'm the only one that wants to work on our marriage? And we heard that question enough times. We said, we ought to do something about that. And so we actually created a video series called One Person Can, and it's 7 videos. And each video talks about one thing that you can do to change the dynamics in your marriage relationship, even if your spouse has no interest in working on it.
Whether apathy or against.
Yep. Whether they're just coasting or they're actually pushing back. So if you're interested in getting that series, we'll talk more before the end of the day. They're free, it's online, and we can give you a link. I'm just trying to think of how to do that.
Should they text you?
They can text me. Yeah, text me. Just put One Person Can and your email address, and we'll send you a link to that video series.
Okay, we can take 1 or 2 more questions before this one starts.
Anybody else?
We have a taker in the front.
Listening to your the question that was posed to you, sounded like it may have been a love language issue. Sounds like he may have had the love language of acts of service, and he's doing this thinking this is how I love. Yep. And hers could be quality time. So I think it sounds like they need to learn each other's love languages and try to apply that.
Yeah, that could be helpful too.
Could be a Gary Smalley miss. So Gary Smalley has done a great job, 5 love languages.
He did leave out food.
He left out food, so, could have been better, but it's a great book. It's a good resource. So, yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions? Oh, back here.
Yesterday you mentioned fasting is something you would do, and I didn't know, do you do it as a family, including the kids? Do you do it regularly, like every month? Do you do it annually, or just individually? Can you expand on that?
I think the answer is yes to all of the above minus the kids. We have never made them do that before.
Although their diet did change when we were doing the Daniel
Not
fast.
very much. At that point, our oldest was barely out of toddlerhood and early preschool, and so and won't eat lentils. So between those 2 things, we did not try to make the kids do it. But I think, and from my perspective, my take is I would never ask the kids to eat a fasting diet unless they chose to for their own spiritual reasons and were old enough to make that decision, because it isn't as much fun as a normal diet, and I don't want them to have a negative, my parents are doing this to me, kind of an outlook. Richie and I, at this point, when we attended here, we fasted when the whole church fasted, and that was a really positive experience. Since then, we have fasted a few days here and there, sometimes together, sometimes individually. It kind of just depends on what the need is and why we're doing it. And sometimes we'll do a just juice fast. Sometimes we'll do a full 3-week Daniel fast. It's kind of just shifted based off of our needs. And so, yeah, I think does that?
Yeah, and I agree. I would not push the kids into it unless they were old enough to choose that for themselves. And ours, who is old enough, he wouldn't choose that at this point. That would be a pretty That'd be a pretty big deal for him to say, yeah, I want to do that Daniel fast thing.
And with our youngest, we're still trying to make him eat food. So, of any variety, that's a full quasi-balanced meal. So, yeah.
Yeah, we're great on the whole food thing. Right here. Daniel fast. You want to give the...
I'll give a very quick version. If you Google it, you can get the long version, but the short version is in Daniel 11.
I think so.
Off the top of my head, he got word that Jerusalem was in extreme disrepair and broken, and evil was infiltrating, and it really hit his heart deeply. So he prayed and fasted until, as he was waiting for news that there had been a change. And it says somewhere in that chapter that he took out meat and wine and all pleasant food. Pleasant food, which leaves a lot of room for yes.
It does.
And
the way we interpreted it here when we did it was basically, did we say raw?
No, we did not.
We just said vegan.
Not in
water.
January.
Yeah.
You got to have warm food in January. The way we interpreted it, and again, there's a lot of room for interpretation there, is that we cut out all processed foods because, let's face it, if it comes out of a can, it's probably going to be pleasant. So, and then we took out animal products, which included margarine, butter, sugar. Sugar's definitely pleasant, so we took that out. And so it was mostly a vegan diet and water, not juice.
No juice, yeah, just water.
And we did it for 3 weeks. That's the amount of time he did it. It doesn't have to be that long, but at that point he got word that there had been a change. And if I recall, there was the angel of Babylon was fighting against the angel from...
You're wading off into waters that are going to get us lost.
You're right, we're going to get lost. It's a really interesting story. I highly recommend reading it. That's probably the best way to put it.
Good question. It was fun to do it as a congregation. And
It
even the
was.
potlucks were Daniel potlucks for 3 weeks, so...
As we went on year by year, we kind of changed it up, and some people fasted from media for 21 days. Some people fasted from the radio and TV, and there was all sorts of different fasts. But the main idea was, as a congregation, we were doing it for 21 days.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. It was a powerful way to start the year each year. It was cool.
Yeah.
So, any other questions? Good questions. All right, you'll get
Okay.
another shot at us.
Yep,
So
well-
we'll come back to it.
If we can have the PowerPoint on, whoever is in charge of such powerful things. I mean, the world won't end if we don't, but really, you came here to see pictures of our growing up, right? And so the next one is our testimony, so you get pictures. There's no notes that you need to take. It's just pictures.
Yeah, if you're looking at your workbook, don't. For this session, there's nothing
If you want to
there.
see Richie with long, fluffy hair, I mean, that's the real reason you came here today.
Yeah.
So as they're working on that, I'll just kind of set us up of where we're going to go for this next. We really believe that our stories matter. I'm a therapist. I really believe that knowing our stories matters. But from a spiritual standpoint, as we said last night, being able to articulate where we come from as a visioning process to where we're going is also really powerful. And we're particularly blessed when we get to share this story because sometimes we forget how awful we were. I know, how could you forget something like that? But we do occasionally because we've been, relatively stable for quite a while now. And in telling these stories, it does remind us of some really deep pain, but it also reminds us of some really, really deep goodness and really, really deep faithfulness of God. And those are the stories that are worthy of telling. And let me tell you, that is the only reason why I would choose to tell this story from a pulpit. Because, as we said earlier, we are not shiny, either one of us, in this story. But God comes out looking really powerful and really good and really kind. And that makes it worth telling the story. So this is a story of healing. But before you can heal, you have to be hurt. And so the whole story is interspersed with a lot of goodness and a lot of heartache and sadness. And so we're just going to kind of take you through it. And if you have questions, you're welcome to hold on to them or text Richie until the end, and we will go from there.
And if you are parents with young kids and
Don't see
we
any
see
in
your
here.
kids come into the room, there's none here now, but if we see them come in, we'll shift the language we use to describe the stories so that it is kid appropriate. But for now, we're just going to go for it.
Yep.
So Timmy and I met at Camp Myvinen in northern Idaho. We met there for the first time when she was, how old were you when you took rock climbing from me?
9. We actually make jokes that we started the same year at Camp Myvinen. I was an adventure camper, which is the youngest group they have in, and he was staff.
Yep. We don't remember anything about that except she remembers taking rock climbing from my partner, and my partner only taught with me, so...
I'm quite sure he wasn't there, but Mindy was so pretty. I liked her. She was one of the big girls. And when you're little and the big girls, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
He did not register. And that's actually a gift from God, that we do not have any remembrance of each other until we were both of legal age.
Yes, yes. Yep. So fast forward, 10 years, whatever it took for you to be old enough to be staff, and I was in seminary at this point, and I chose not to spend the summers in Michigan at the seminary because it's Michigan, and Idaho's better. And so I came out to work at camp and got there for staff training and getting to know all these new staff, and Timmy and I just kind of hit it off, and the rest started growing from there. So finally, I'm just trying to decide how much I'm going to cut here.
A lot.
I'm cutting. So fast forward like 2 years or so, and I proposed to Timmy aboard a 43-foot yacht moored on the Columbia River the night before Christmas Eve. You got
That's
a
weird.
Red dot.
It's on my hand.
Picture lower right. That would be us.
It doesn't go that far.
Yep.
Huh.
We snapped a picture. This is before selfie sticks and everything.
Wait, I can't hear what?
Oh, it just goes
Oh,
through.
tricky.
Never mind.
I won't try to point something at it then.
No more pointing. You can point at that one just for fun if you want. So we took this picture that you're looking at in the lower right-hand screen. It was everything was perfect. We'd had like dozens and dozens of dead roses from Camp Myvinen where we met. We had dozens of fresh roses. And my family came and decorated, and they baked a spice cake in the galley of the yacht so that when she came on board, it would smell good. And did this whole scavenger hunt around Portland, Oregon to get her there.
After taking me snowboarding the day before, so I couldn't move, literally, I couldn't, how I said I couldn't raise my hands. That was the day before he asked me to marry him.
Well, see, I just come out of seminary, and one of the classes I took in seminary was on evangelism. And in evangelism, one of the things they teach you is how to remove objections.
Beat them to a
I
pulp.
was practicing what I had been taught. So took her snowboarding, just, I figured that would kind of soften her up a little bit.
It's true.
And everything was perfect on board the boat, except for one little thing. It was a great big boat with an itsy-bitsy little heater. The night before Christmas Eve. We were freezing to death on board, so we only took our jackets off for a moment, snapped that picture,
Yep.
and then moved on. So I asked, you said yes. We risked our lives driving home to your parents' house after that night in the snowstorm, and then everything was happily ever after, right?
Of course. That's not a good story. We decided we wanted to get married in something other than a church because, as Richie said, I work in a church. Who wants to get married where they work? Okay, that makes sense-ish. So we found this beautiful outside venue after making my parents go through a lot of dairy barns in Enumclaw, Washington, and we didn't find one that would let us due to insurance purposes. We found this beautiful venue. We had this really beautiful wedding, and then we left on our picture-perfect honeymoon.
Yep. So we weren't even to the end of our honeymoon when our marriage hit the rocks. Nobody in our premarital counseling had mentioned that this might happen. None of the books, and certainly not the movies we'd watched, which, of course, give you a very clear picture of what marriage looks like. Nothing had prepared us for what our honeymoon might be. And in our case, we had waited physically for marriage, and so we were looking forward to that honeymoon night and how things were going to go, and this was going to be great, and we're on a gorgeous island location, and this is going to be just romantic and wonderful, and it wasn't. It was, instead of pleasure, there was pain. It was not a great experience at all. In fact, it was horrible. And our inability to make things work sexually just triggered all kinds of stuff in both of us that we were completely unprepared to deal with. And so our honeymoon was not that picture-perfect honeymoon. In fact, one honeymoon sunset found Timmy and I sitting on the beach watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, Timmy sitting on one end of the beach and Richie on the other. And that's how things started, and that's kind of how things kept going for, unfortunately, quite a while into our marriage years.
Yeah, years.
That was portent of things to come.
And this started cycles that were very negative and included a lot of anger and withdrawal. And this pattern, like as Richie said, would last for years. And we don't want to make it sound like everything was all negative, because it wasn't. We are fairly adventurous people and find ourselves in very strange situations, which bring a lot of humor a lot of the time. But we would kind of swing between, oh, it was the best of times, to, whew, it was the worst of times. So when we were bad, we were very, very bad. But when we were good, everyone wanted to play with us because we were fun folks. And we were pastoring at that point down in Eastern Oregon, and we had an amazing little 3-church district, and we had amazing people that we got to work with. I've heard some of these horror stories of what churches do to brand new pastors' wives, and I was 21 and still in school, and they were so kind and so generous, and they taught me how to be a pastor's wife with all the love and respect and nurturing. I mean, they really loved us well in that district. But things were still going pretty rocky on the physical aspect of our relationship. And so, I mean, when you're the pastor and pastor's wife, who do you go to when you live in a very rural environment, and anyone you ask is probably related to half the people in your church? And so, we did the normal routes of, well, you talk to your doctor. Well, doctors aren't really helpful, at least mine wasn't.
The doctor was an elder.
I didn't go to that doctor. I went to a doctor in a different state, actually, because I'm really into separation, keeping things in their boxes, separate. But things just got worse and worse for us. And on one hand, we were compatible in so many ways. I mean, our first renovation project, because we love taking old things and making them habitable, was a trailer that was older than my mother, which I just get such a kick out of still. It was this marvelous it was an early 50s, single wide, and they let us do anything we wanted. And let me just tell you, sponge paint isn't that good no matter what your beginning surface is. But it was really fun to try. So they really let us that was our first attempt at these things. And so, I mean, we were working together, we were having fun, but as newlyweds and oldie-weds are wont to do, we would try to come together physically, and it just wouldn't work. And we didn't know why. No book we had read had really prepared. I knew I had, some problems in my family of origin and stuff, but I mean, is that supposed to affect you once you're a full-fledged grown-up? Surely not. And we didn't, at that point, have anyone in our lives who could kind of give us different information. But I did try counseling at that point, and I found the one person in our whole county that wasn't in some way related to our church members, and kind of said, hey, here's what's going on. And she asked some really good questions, and I found out for the first time that having childhood sexual trauma really will impact your marriage. But again, when you're 21, you don't necessarily know that, and especially when you thought you had a pretty normal growing up, which wasn't accurate. But again, when you don't have anything to compare it against, and you don't live with the people who are storytelling people, how would you know that this wasn't normal and what you were experiencing was normal based off of your not normal? See how convoluted it gets even in the explaining? And we didn't have words for anything that we were experiencing. And so we would try to come together physically, and it would either work but be painful, or not work, or, I mean, just, all the things that can go wrong in that area of life. And Richie would get angry because he felt like I was doing it on purpose. And then I would sense his anger, and I'm a withdrawer. I withdraw for safety, but then he would pursue because he's feeling abandoned because I'm withdrawing, so he would come closer. You don't have to really do it, though. And
That's kind of how it went, too.
yeah, that's really, actually, there you go, present tense reenactment. And then he would come closer until I felt like I was being attacked. And, even withdrawers only withdraw for so long, and then they pull out all guns blaring, and we're going to take out the enemy. And then the dust would settle, and we'd like, wow, we can't ever do that again. We can't ever be that awful to each other. And we never hit each other, but you may be able to tell we both have a lot of words, and we used them as very deadly weapons against each other. That was the first thing we had to stop doing in our marital journey.
Yep.
And so there were probably a few intuitive souls in our congregation who detected that not all was well in the parish, in Paradise. But for the most part, we really kept this part of our marriage a secret, A, because who talks about things like that, and B, we're the pastoral couple. We're supposed to have an idea of what we're doing, and we didn't. And like I said, we didn't come from a storytelling people where it was okay to say, this is where I've been, and here's how God has brought me through. And so we didn't know that other people even experienced what we were going through. We just knew that we were living in hell, and we didn't know how to make it stop.
Yep. So fast forward several years, and we were moved here to Spokane to plant a brand new church. And that was quite a shock to our system. We'd been in a 3-church district with 3 pastors. Those were the old days. We don't do it like that anymore. But we had this pretty easy assignment down there with great people. And then we moved up here, and we did something that I don't recommend, but it's what we did. We did a cold start, which means we didn't have a core group coming from anywhere. We just came into town and said, we're going to find some people, and we're going to go start this thing. And we weren't necessarily wanted here. In fact, I think the pastors in Spokane met. Actually, I know they did. They met to talk about this idea of planting a new church. It wasn't their idea. It was the conference's idea. And the pastors voted unanimously that they didn't want to plant a church. And the conference said, well, Richie and Timmy are coming, and we're planting a church. So we weren't exactly, the red carpet was not exactly rolled out for us or our project. It wasn't personal towards us. It was just they didn't think it was a good time. So that made it more difficult, and the pressure started mounting. Because, when you have an established church, you don't have to think about where you're going to meet, right? We're going to meet here. You don't have to think about who's going to lead the music. Carl is going to lead the music, right? It's just how it's going to be. In our case, we started meeting in a dance studio. If you ever want a fun experience, Teddy, preach in front of a big mirror. It's really awesome.
A mirror all the way around you.
Yeah, it was interesting at times. So all these things, the pressure was just on. And of course, anytime we start new projects, we look around and say, who's doing that the absolute best? And we compare our progress to theirs, right? And the pressure was intense, and it was intense here, and it played out. And so all that pressure led to angry outbursts and tearful arguments at home. And it was during this season that despair began to clutch, especially at my heart, as I wondered if things would literally be like this forever. And I started thinking, man. And I remember we lived out in the outer bands of suburbia, and I'd go walking down the driveway.
Church.
What?
So, that big picture right there, that is not the outer bands of suburbia, is it? I mean, seriously here. There are cows right behind where the picture is being taken. Notice you can't see anybody else's houses. Yeah. It's not the wilderness, I completely agree, but it's not suburbia, even the outer bands. Continue, it's your color.
Then why were you talking?
Because I wanted you to practice submission.
We do this every time. I'm practicing submission? Oh, okay. Yes, dear. So, I have no idea where I am now. Thank you
You
very
are
much.
right there.
Yes, I am. So I would go walking down the driveway from this little house at night, and I'd talk to God and just say, God, is this it? Is this where we're stuck? Is this how it's going to be? I don't know if I can survive this. I don't know if we're going to make it. And I contemplated the possibility that our marriage might not survive. We had made a promise, because we come from broken homes ourselves, that we'd never use the D word. We would never use the D word. But I started thinking, I don't know how this works. And in reality, at church, we'd walk into church, we'd put on our happy Sabbath faces, right? And we may have been sunshine and laughter at church, but at home, we were falling apart. We were absolutely hemorrhaging, and our hearts were breaking, and our marriage was on the end. And again, this is how I was thinking, not saying it was accurate. In fact, it wasn't, but I just wanted Timmy to get fixed. I just knew that if she would really buckle down and deal with her stuff, then we'd be okay. And that was kind of my mindset. I just knew this was all her issue, and I was very happy to let it be her issue. But I was frustrated because I didn't feel like she was progressing as fast as she could.
That's true. He did think that. I was the identified problem for a lot of years because my trauma was very obvious. And what we didn't really take into consideration is we both come from a background of trauma. It's not just mine. We just have different kinds of trauma. And so putting us both together has been a recipe for disaster more than a few times. But because I was the identified problem, I went to counselors. And then after that didn't work super well, we went to counselors. Sometimes I would go to counselors, and we would go to counselors. And they were helpful, and we gained some really great tools, but it never really got down to the bottom of what was going on. And I haven't actually done any anecdotal research on this, but at least in our case, our stories are a perfect blend to hit each other's buttons like nobody's business. Like, I don't think you could find two stories that are more ill-matched in some ways. Because the things that I find really hard relationally are so important to him. And so he's got this great big buzzer that says, if I can't do it, it hits that button, and he goes a little berserk. And likewise, the things that are really important to me relationally, he hits that button. I mean, nuclear explosion regularly. And so we gained a lot of really good tools at counseling, but it was able to lower the symptoms, but we never actually got down to the bottom of what was really going on between the two of us. And so we had seasons, like I mentioned last night, where things would get better. We'd be working the tools, we'd be working the program, and I think the longest stretch we ever had was about 5 months. We're like, okay, we're gonna be okay.
We're healed.
I don't know if we went that far, but we're gonna be okay. And then something would happen, and Richie would get really angry, and I would feel it, so I would withdraw, and we would just start the whole horrible cycle over again.
So during this time, and keep in mind, this is all, we're pastoring, church planting through this story, but during this time, I picked up a couple books that began to challenge my thinking. And I'm a pretty slow learner when it comes to getting through this thick skull of mine, that maybe there's an issue, but I was realizing that, maybe things could be better. I don't know. I wanted them to be better. So I picked up a couple books that began to challenge my thinking. And one book was talking specifically about what it meant to be a godly man. And I'm reading this book, and I'm realizing, I grew up in the church, but I have never heard any of these ideas, and I certainly didn't see it modeled by my dad. So I had no clue. I just went into adulthood, and I'm like, well, I wear adult-sized clothes, and I'm getting a paycheck, so I must be a man. But I had no idea how to live as a man, as certainly not as a Christian man. And the other book started talking about this incredibly radical, strange idea to me that God actually wanted a personal relationship with me. I'd never heard anything like it. It was bizarre. But I liked it. I liked the idea of it, at least. And so I began reading more and watching videos and just kind of digging in. And you'd think that, that would start really transforming me. But I remember it was probably in the barn. I think this fight happened in the barn. And we were probably fighting over real estate, because that's what we fought about most in the barn.
There's the barn.
The roof on your left, that big roof, that'd be the barn that we lived in. And those horses were our neighbors. They lived on the other side of the barn. Yep. And
hay was in the middle. So that means when there were thunderstorms and the horses would get a little bit antsy and they'd start kicking at things, it would wake up our baby.
Yeah. So Caleb wasn't born in a barn, but he did grow up and learn to walk.
He learned to walk in a barn.
Yeah.
That's funny.
So we got into a fight, and Timmy looked at me and she said, all those books you're reading and videos you're watching, they aren't making you any nicer. And I thought to myself, at the time, I thought, I guess it makes sense. If you realize that it's your stuff that is destroying our marriage, that would be a heavy load to carry. I can see why you'd want to push some of the blame and the guilt onto me. And I just dismissed her because my compassion score is what? 0.
Actually, he's up to about a 4 now.
Woo!
But it's been significant
raise.
healing and counseling and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
We've worked really hard.
So that was my response. But it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, that she was right? Because really, if God is getting a hold of you and changing you, who should be the first person to notice the change and be the first recipient of what's changing in you? Who would that be? It'd be your spouse, right? So she was right. I was completely wrong, but she was making a valid point. It took me about 5 to 7 years more to recognize that. But yeah, so we were just spiraling down, down, down. And then Timmy began to change the rules on me. And really, this was probably where things began to actually shift. They got worse for quite a while still, but they began to shift. Timmy starts to change the dialogue in our home because you were working on your master's at this point, weren't you?
I was finished with my master's.
And you were seeing some friends that she was working with at Anna Ogden Hall.
I had an accountability group of 2 other Christian women that we were meeting with weekly for 2 to 4 hours a week, actually. And we were talking about things like how do we love well? And how do we continue to grow in freedom in our own hearts? And we were looking at family of origin. We were looking at present relationships. We were going through a workbook, but we were really, really going deep with each other. And we were reevaluating how all of us had defined love based off of our family of origins.
So out of that context, she begins to see some things in these other women and in their marriages. And she starts coming home and saying some crazy, crazy things to me. Crazy things like, this can't, excuse me, my throat wants me to cough. She says, this can't all be me. Some of this has to be your stuff. This can't just be all my stuff. And I'm thinking, yes, it can. Clearly, because anyone who knows me knows I'm perfect. And she, you laugh, but I actually believed it.
Well, and to his credit, we had both been agreeing that I was the problem for roughly 8 years. That's a long time for me to suddenly shift the script, just saying. So.
And I really liked that script because it let me off the hook.
It's true.
That wasn't conscious. I just was very comfortable with that. So I remember, and this is just to give you an idea of where I was at in my head. We're living in the barn, and they had this long, quarter-mile long driveway from the barn out to the road. And we'd gotten in another fight in our little apartment. I don't remember what it was over, but probably real estate. And I remember throwing on my coat and hat and just storming out of the apartment. And I started walking down the driveway, and it was late fall and first snowstorm of the year coming. And in this area, we get those big, juicy snowflakes, in the fall and early winter. And I'm walking down this long driveway, looking up into the sky, snowflakes hitting my face, and I just start talking out loud to God. And I looked up into the sky and I said, God, if there's any part of this mess that's my responsibility, just let me see what it is. Because I honestly believed it was all her. Well, be careful what you pray. God is quick to answer that prayer. And I didn't hear an audible voice, but boy, he spoke very plainly to my heart that night. And God said, Richie, you need to listen to your wife. What? Clearly, she's the one that needs to listen to me. If she would, we'd be done, it'd be good. But nope, you need to listen to your wife. And then God said to me that night, you need to stop criticizing Timmy. You let me work on her. And from now on, let's agree that you and I are going to focus on Richie. Now, most of you in this room are probably a little quicker than I am, and so if that had happened to you, there would have been an amazing turning point in your relationship. I'm a little slower than that, so that got my attention for 5 to 10 minutes, and we continued to spiral downward.
So as we said this morning, we finally had found a piece of property. We were very excited to move out of that barn. Actually, that little tiny bungalow that was 574 square feet was actually not any bigger than the barn, but there was no horses on the other side of it, so that was progress. And we had a sabbatical coming, because within our pastoral context, every 7 years you get a 1-month sabbatical, and you can add another month of vacation to it. So we thought, what would be restful? What would be a way to really rejuvenate ourselves, our souls, our marriage? I know. Let's build a house. With our own 2 hands, 4 in that case. So we found a contractor who would coach us, and I'm pretty good with a pneumatic nailer, apparently. Who knew? Don't need to know. So we decided to build this house. And actually, while we were working on the house, we did okay. It was when we stopped that we started fighting again. And so things just kept escalating and escalating. It was, I think that one of the breaking points in this point for me was we had a schedule that we were keeping, because we had, our contractor coming to help us. I think it was 3 days a week, 4 days a week, something like that. And so our goal was to be on the work site by 7 a.m. so that we could, before the heat of the day, kind of a thing, and work on it. But on the off days, Richie had started getting angry at me because I wasn't getting up on time. I'm like, but we don't have to be anywhere by any time. He's like, breakfast is at 7, you need to be there. No, I don't, actually. I don't eat breakfast, so. And he's in charge of breakfast. He makes breakfast. I mean, he's always made breakfast. That is one of the best things that made it into our wedding vows, actually, is he'd make breakfast for the rest of our lives. For reals, it was in there, and he chose that.
That was at a church social or something.
Yes.
I made that foolish promise.
But there was a lot of witnesses, so. But it was in that context, I was really confused. I'm like, why does he get to decide when I'm going to be up in the morning, when we've never had a conversation about this, and I've never agreed to this? But he kept saying, this is where you need to be. So I reached out to a friend of ours who's a pastor down in Oregon, and I'm like, Gary, I'm a little confused. Here's what's happening. Am I being difficult? Because Richie's saying I'm being difficult, but I'm confused because I don't think I'm being difficult. I'm not a morning person. I've never been a morning person. And so that was on a Friday, and then on Sunday, Gary called Richie as a follow-up to that conversation.
So Sunday, we're heading out to the job site, and our house was right about in the framing stage there, I think, that day. And we were just firing up the air compressor and getting everything going, and my cell phone rings, and it's Gary on the other end of the line. So I walked away from the job site. And the property that we were building on is kind of a split-level property, and there's some cliffs on one part that drops down into the lower part, and you're looking down into the woods. And so I went over and sat at the top of the cliffs, and I'm looking down into the trees below, and Gary starts talking, and he didn't he didn't beat around the bush. He said, Richie, I'm on my way to camp meeting, so I don't have much time to talk. But based on my conversations with Timmy and my observations of the two of you, you are spiritually and emotionally abusive to your wife, and it needs to stop. Well, that got my attention. Nobody had ever talked to me like that before and used those words to describe me. And fortunately, he didn't hang up after saying that. He stayed on the line. And I remember sitting in the top of the cliff there, looking down at the trees, tears running down my cheeks, as Gary said, Richie, God's not done with you. He looks at you and he sees gold. But what you're doing isn't working, and it needs to stop. You can't continue down this path. And Gary called me to a higher level to consider loving my wife differently. And I'd like to say that was the beginning of the turnaround. But what it really was I think at the end of that conversation, I probably moved to a place where I was willing to admit that maybe things were more serious than I thought they were. And that was needed, but it could have been different. It could have been more, perhaps. But at least I began to realize, you know what, we're in some deep trouble here, and we really need to get Timmy help. That's pretty much where I stayed with that. Yep.
It's true. So shortly thereafter, we found ourselves in a darker still valley. Like I said, building the house was the easy part. And I just have to do a shout out right now to Larry and Sonya, because every time I think of this house, I think of some very, very, they helped us with quite a few things on our house, but my fondest memories of them helping us was as we were trying to put in a very complicated stair railing. And it took all of our mathematical skills combined, or maybe just all of Larry's and we just watched, to figure out putting it in. And that's some of my fondest memories of building the house, actually, is those days with you guys doing that stair railing particularly, because the stair railing was what was standing between us and having Christmas in our house. Because we had to have that in before the building permit would be signed off. And so they came and spent as many days as it took for us to finish that so we could put in that 17-foot Christmas tree. And so it's amazing how God interlaces so much goodness and so much heartache into the same stories. And so, I mean, this was a heartache. And there were glimmers of such incredible beauty and goodness in the creation of it, too.
And there were several years between
Yes.
building the shell and then getting back to it and actually
yes.
finishing it off. So.
Yeah, because we had to try living, 4 of us in 574 square feet for like 18 months before we thought it'd be okay to move in. But so going back up, so we're still in the building phase. We just finished our sabbatical. So the that side picture of just it being shelled in is where we found ourselves. And we went back to our church after being gone for 2 months on sabbatical and found that it was falling apart. It wasn't because of heresy. It wasn't because of embezzlement. There was a variety of reasons, but we left a fairly thriving church of over 100 people and came back to a very challenged church in under 50 people. And that's a whole separate story. But what it did do is it put a whole lot of extra stress on our marriage. And we didn't have any capacity for extra stress at that point. And how I deal with stress is I stop eating, which is unfortunate because food is helpful for survival. And combined with my trauma and not eating and our stress and our church's stress, we decided that it would be good for me to take some time away and do some intensive counseling because I just wasn't making any headway on my story and the symptoms that were coming from my story. And so I was going to go, and a couple nights before I was going to leave, we had some friends come over who I'd worked with at the mission, and really neat, godly couple. We'd really enjoyed them at different seasons in our lives, and they came over, and we shared with them kind of what was going on, that I was going to be leaving for a while, and asked them to pray. And then Jerry turned to Richie and said,
Jerry looked at me and he said, Richie, Timmy can go do all the counseling she wants, and she should. But he said, Richie, you're the key. And I hated him for that. Because what I heard him say was, Richie, it's your fault. All the guys filled that in really quick. It's your fault. And I'm like, nope, sorry, my fault plate is full. Pretty sure this church plant collapse is my fault and nothing else gets to be my fault. And I just totally dismissed it. But I did make mental note, I don't like him. I do not like him. And filed that away for future reference. I still don't like him.
That's funny.
Yeah.
We'll get to that part of the story in just a moment.
Minute.
So I ended up being gone for 5 weeks, and Richie came and joined me for one of them, and it was an absolute fiasco because he decided that they didn't have anything worthy to say because they came from a different theological bent than we did. They didn't believe in wilderness living being the answer to all of life's problems, so everything that they said was null and void.
That pretty well sums it up. Yep.
Yeah.
It's great.
And so that left me in a really difficult place because I'm learning all these new categories for my own heart and healing, and Richie says everything they're doing is crap. Well, I've got to go home, and we're just in the same place as when I left, and what are we going to do? How's that going to work? And I remember praying about it very, very fervently. And I called him up about 3 days before I was scheduled to come home and said, I will come home when you have accountability. He wasn't happy about that.
No, I wasn't happy.
No.
I had a 2.5, 3-year-old child.
Just turned 2.
Our church was imploding, and I wanted help.
Yeah.
I wasn't so worried about this. I just wanted some backup on taking care of the kid.
Yep.
Yeah, I was very
Which
unhappy.
was good motivation. I will not come home until you have accountability. I don't care if it's a counselor, it can be a mentor, it just has to be someone who's wise and you're committed to meeting with that wise person regularly.
So when Timmy hung up the phone after saying that, I was furious. And it took me a while to calm down and kind of analyze the conversation and realize, she means it. And I realized I've got to do something because I don't want to keep raising this kid alone and trying to deal with this spiraling church. And so I got thinking, going through my head, who do I know? Who do I know that would be good accountability? Who would be good accountability? There's only one person. It was the jerk who'd said that I was the key. Because after saying, Richie, you're the key, he'd also offered and said, hey, if you ever want to talk about stuff, I'd be happy to meet with you on a regular basis. I can't even imagine how excited and enthusiastic I must have sounded when I picked up the phone and called Jerry at the mission and said, hey, a while back you offered that maybe we could, get together and chat, and I think I need to do that. I don't think I was very enthusiastic at all. But he said yes, and we made an appointment. I called Timmy, and she came home. Phew. Mission accomplished, problem solved. Or not. Or not. So she wanted me to have accountability and support. And so I made this appointment with Jerry.
And I just want to say, I wasn't asking him to do anything I wasn't doing too. I was still continuing to meet with my accountability group on a weekly basis and stuff too. I was inviting him to join me at the level I was doing. I was not asking him to go beyond what I was doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you'd been doing that for what, 2 or 3 years at that point?
3 or 4.
3 or 4?
It was a long time.
Yeah, and I'd been really happy for her to do that. I thought that was a really good thing for her to do, right? So I was content with that arrangement, but now the rules are changing a little bit. So I start meeting with Jerry, and it's a little sobering when you're a pastor to walk into a men's mission, and I walk past a banner every week that said, "Hope starts here." Which is a great banner for a church, by the way, if it's true. Hope starts here. And I'd walk past that banner, and I'd go upstairs to Jerry's office. Jerry's not a counselor. He's not a pastor. He is retired Air Force. And he's the head of the men's recovery program at Union Gospel Mission. He's still there today. And Jerry would just look at me, and we'd start talking. And we were spending 2 to 3 hours every week, just the two of us. And we spent 2 or 3 hours, Jerry and I, 2 or 3 hours every week for about, 9 years. So ladies, how many of you knew that 2 men could even talk for 2 to 3 hours? Is that like a huge shock? It's possible. We did it on a regular basis, and we could have gone longer most times. But what was amazing, what would happen is that I'd walk in, and I would just be hot because Timmy, frankly, was horrible. I started to try to make some good changes, and my thought is, hey, I'm making changes. She's going to be like, oh, that's the best thing ever. I love you so much. And not a chance. No, she just turned up the burners and turned up the heat. And
You got to see if it's real.
Yeah. Turns out any smart, intelligent woman does the exact same thing. We've talked to enough couples now that that's not uncommon. But I'd walk into Jerry's office, you won't believe what she did this week. I'd just be going off on how terrible she was. And he'd listen. And then he'd look at me and he'd say, so, Richie, what did Timmy need from you in that situation? I'm like, this isn't about me. It's about her. And he'd just stick to his guns. How would Jesus have responded to Timmy in that situation? So what do you need to do when you go home today to make that right? So here, 9 years I spent meeting with Jerry the Jerk. And he knows. We've called him that everywhere across the country.
He's been in the audience when Richie called him that, so.
He wears that name with pride, because I'm not the only one that thinks he's that. And he's actually an incredible godly man who I love. But 9 years. 9 years. And the agenda every week for 9 years never changed. This was the agenda for our time together. How to be a godly man and how to love our wives well. That was it. I'd come in with whatever story was fresh, but it always came back to, what does it mean to be a godly man in this context? How do you love Timmy well in this context? And it got almost depressing because I'd go in to see Jerry, and I knew that this time he was going to see my side, and I was going to go home and set her straight. And inevitably, I'd go home, and I'd walk through the door and go, I'm sorry. Again, I blew it. And that was the process that started. And that was the process that God began to use to get a hold of me and my heart and to begin to make a lasting change in our marriage.
So while this was happening, keep in mind our church plant is on its last breath. And so we talked to our denominational leaders and trying to figure out what are we going to do about this church. And we decided it was time for us to step down as the pastoral couple. Maybe someone else could breathe life into this church where we no longer had the capacity to be able to. And so our conference president sat down with us and he's like, okay, well, we've got this position over here open. They wouldn't want you. You guys are church planters. You're suspect. True. Yeah, you don't want to go there. Okay, but this one's open. And we're like, that's a really long ways from Spokane, because all of our people now were in Spokane. I mean, our friends, yes, and friends matter, but our people, at this point, Richie was meeting with Jerry, I was meeting with my accountability group, and we had another marriage mentor couple that was meeting with us every other week for an evening. On top of that, we were spending 8 to 10 hours a week specifically focused on our marriage with other people between both of us. And every suggestion for, oh, you could pastor here, you could do that, they all meant that we had to leave. We'd kind of created an ICU for our marriage, and we had the sneaking suspicion we were not ready to be unplugged yet, and that we would die maritally if we didn't have the support that we had created. So a movement leaving all of that. So after talking about it amongst the two of us and praying about it a lot, we decided that it was more important to stay in Spokane and keep our ICU intact than to leave and have that go away. But what that also meant is we were stepping onto a whole new precipice, because instead of having a church plant that's failing, because now we don't have that, instead we have Richie without gainful employment. Oh, that's stressful too. So that's why last night's letter of I'm so glad you've been unemployed, that's kind of some of the context that comes out of.
Yep. So as all this is unfolding, we're stepping away from my job, working for the church. I'm meeting with Jerry every week, and we just keep meeting. And as we talked and processed, I began to see. And I tell some of the dark side of where I started, just because that helps you realize I really needed to see. And I honestly didn't even begin to understand my part in our relationship and the pain that I was causing for years. But as Jerry and I talked, my eyes began to be opened. And Jerry challenged me one day. I remember sitting in his office upstairs there in the Mission. He said, I want to encourage you to start praying a prayer that I don't know if you're praying right now. And he said, I'd like to encourage you to begin asking God to teach you how to love Timmy well. I'm like, okay, I could do that. And so I did. I began making that part of my routine, to just ask God to show me how to love this woman well. And you know what? That's another prayer God's excited to answer. And he began to show me. And that was kind of the context of last night's story about the bath. It came out of me asking God, how do I love Timmy well? And God beginning to show me in very specific details in some instances, here's what that looks like, and here's what you need to do now, and taking very specific baby steps to begin connecting with her. But all of this is moving, and my heart begins to change. God begins to get a hold of my heart in a brand new way, and to soften that zero compassion heart, and to start drawing me towards my wife in a very different way. And the ice begins to thaw in the Brower house.
On the inside. On the outside, that was the first year we started farming, and our last snow was June 1st.
Yeah, that was great.
Doesn't God have a sense of humor? Because, Richie is no longer gainfully employed as a pastor, so we're going to farm. Because Richie's always wanted to be that wilderness, self-sustaining farmer guy. So this is him putting up our greenhouse. And last snow of the year, June 1st. That's just funny. But as things began to shift inside the house and the ice began to thaw, I was afraid at a biochemical level that this was just another stint of good behavior. So even though there was not physical domestic violence in our home, we still had the domestic violence cycles going, and there's a biochemical piece to that as well. So there's certain chemicals that are released into your brain when certain things happen. So like when you give birth, you are flooded with dopamine and serotonin. You're bonding. It's good. You love this baby, all those things. And that's what's going to get you through all those really awful nights that are about to come, is all that flooding of neurochemicals. But from a relational standpoint, too, our cycle had been that we would have a good stretch and things would be okay, and then there would be like these little irritations that would start to grow. And we knew, we wouldn't have ever put words on it, but we knew that what that meant was we are building towards an explosion. And I won't speak for Richie's body, but I can tell you mine, looking back, the neurochemicals were adjusting to be prepared for that explosion. So suddenly we're not having explosions anymore, but there's still the tiny irritations. And so I can feel the chemicals rising, and I don't know how long I have to hold those biochemicals, because it's stressful to hold those kind of stress hormones, because this is not the warm, fuzzy dopamine kind. This is the adrenaline and the cortisol that say you have to be prepared to fight or flight shortly. And so we would have these things start to happen, and we would just be poised for that blow up, and Richie would go, I need to go for a walk. I'll come back and we'll reconvene this conversation in about half an hour, okay? And out he would go. And I'm stuck with all these chemicals saying, he's going to kill you. Kill him first. and then he'd come back in, and we'd have like a civil conversation. But the chemicals never completely went away. And to his credit, these are chemical pathways that were created in my childhood. He just added to them. He didn't create the whole thing. And so I did, as we said earlier, what many women do, trying to live with this idea that this new thing isn't good behavior, but it's actually a new way of life, is really hard to hold. And it wasn't a conscious decision that I made, but I started bringing up every hot topic we had ever had in our marriage. We talked about money, kaboom, money, and I would just wait to see how he would respond. And he didn't get as angry, and he didn't get raging, and he would pray about it, and I'd be like, oh, that's weird, very strange. I'm very, very uncomfortable. Let's find another topic. And so, kaboom, I would throw him with, the big one for us was who owns time? Because once you have a child, someone has to be with that child so they don't die. So if you both have free time, who's with the child and who gets to be free? Who owns time? And Richie was convinced he owned all time, because my job was to be the mother to this child, which meant I always had to be with him. And so I threw that at him, kaboom! And he went, I really think it's important for you to be able to spend time away from us. Would you like to do that tonight or tomorrow night? Okay, what is going on? And so, but again, these things started happening, and for the most part, he stayed really even. And I remember the night we were in the bungalow, I was washing dishes, he was drying them, and this is when I knew for sure this was not a stint of good behavior. So he's drying the dishes, and he turns to me and he says, you know, when I would do these things, and he mentioned some specific things, he said, I can't imagine what my effect on you must have been. Would you tell me? And I looked at him, because again, this is Mr. Zero Compassion Score guy who wants to know his impact on my heart. So I start telling him, like just a little bit, and he's like, well, but then I would do this, and what would that do? Well, and I would say a little more and a little more, and he got tears in his eyes, and he said, honey, that is not the man I want to be to you. I am so sorry. I can't promise that I'll never be that awful again, but with God's help, I don't want to be. I am committing to you that that is not the man I want to be. And I looked at him, and again, from a neurochemical standpoint, I'm so confused right now. But there's also this shift. It's not just adrenaline and cortisol. Now there's more and more dopamine of, oh, his heart is good towards me consistently. And the bonding chemicals start being joined into the mix in a new way. And I realized this isn't just good behavior. God is doing a work in him, in me, in us. And again, I want you to hear, this is a very, very drawn out process. Have you noticed this is not like and then we had this amazing, and it was all good, and the angels and the violins, and it was glorious. No, this is years of slogging it out. And I just want you to hear that, because sometimes people give their testimony and they have this, and I'm so into it. If we could have had a one-time and then we're good, that would have saved us so much money and time and all kinds of things. But I also don't think I ever would have believed it was real, because it actually took this much to help undo those internal and external cycles.
Yep. Okay.
You're somewhere between these two.
Did you want to finish out this?
Nah.
No? Okay. So I started learning some new skills. I started learning how to really listen to Timmy. And I could do pretty good listening if she was talking, sharing stories from like her family of origin, her childhood, friends, whatever. I could do pretty good with that. But when the story started turning to things that I had done that injured and wounded her, I'd fall asleep. I fell asleep in Taco Bell once because she started telling me, remember I said my fault plate was full? Apparently I had a high level of commitment to keeping anything else from going onto that fault plate. And so I would fall asleep. And Timmy started to get frustrated. I don't know what the issue was.
I'm pouring out my heart, and he goes, that's not, again, not a oneness builder.
So she started to give me verbal feedback that this needed to change. It was fairly direct. And so I remember going into Jerry's office one morning. I'm like, Jerry, what do? I keep falling asleep when Timmy's telling me stories about how I've hurt her. What do I do? And he just looked at me. He's like, stand up. And I'm like, what? He's like, stand up. You're not going to fall asleep if you're standing up, so stand up. Because usually we'd be laying in bed, we're getting ready to bed, and I'm just about nodding off. And she's like, and there's that one thing. And I'm like, So he's like, stand up. Well, our bed was up in the loft of our little 574 square feet, and the ceiling goes like this, over the bed, not very high. And so I remember the first night that she's pouring out her heart after Jerry said, stand up, and I'm there in bed, and all of a sudden I go, boom! She's like, you're falling asleep on me. And I stand up over the bed, because I couldn't stand up because the ceiling was too low, so I stood up over the bed, and she carried on.
He was awake. You might as well capitalize on it.
So I began to be able to admit something was brand new for me. I began to be able to admit that I made mistakes. I had been perfect in my own mind for quite some time, and I began to be able to admit that I made mistakes, and I discovered something amazing. I didn't think it could be possible. I discovered that I could admit I made mistakes and survive. And that was, you laugh, but that was a big deal to me. I didn't know if I could get through that. And so,
I would say it actually brought us closer, because I would say we're going to talk about cleaving in our last meeting next. And I would say as we kept working the forgiveness process, and Richie saying, I have made mistakes, will you forgive me? Me saying, I've made mistakes, will you forgive me? We found that became a really, really, not just did he survive, but it was actually bonding, and it actually forged us into a new space.
Yep. And so during that time, Caleb's getting older, and I started
Isn't he
learning.
a cute little bundle? Oh my goodness. He was a perfect farm boy.
He was and is.
Yeah.
And I started learning how to play. I tend to like work a lot, and most of my hobbies are just different forms of work because I like to be able to show that I did something at the end of the day. And so to learn to play kind of felt like a waste of time to me, like, time that could be spent doing something that mattered. But God began showing me that it mattered to my son, it mattered to my wife, And ultimately, it mattered to me. And so I began learning new skills like listening and playing.
And I would go so far, the reason that middle picture is in there with Richie with his hands in the air, I don't know if you can quite tell, he's throwing dirt in the air just to watch it fall down. And that was one of those amazingly glorious, redemptive moments for me as I was watching. You can kind of see Caleb's head in the background going, oh, because, throwing dirt. Is there anything really cooler than to a 2 or 3-year-old? And it was so amazing because it really was repentance. I don't know, Richie's commitment to always be performing, always be right, always be in control, to watch him just throw dirt in the air for the sake of joy on his baby's face. That's why the picture's in there. On one hand, it's not stellar photography or anything, but what it means is that he was embracing something that was really important, and that was just to be free to play. And that was something that was shifting, that was really, really meaningful to me as his wife. At this point, I had a choice, too, as how I was relating to our family. And I remember driving to my accountability group one night. And, as I'm going, I'm thinking about what am I going to talk about tonight? And I drew a blank. I couldn't think of what I was going to talk about. And I was like, well, there's got to be something to talk about. Come on. It's going to be 3 women for 4 hours. Not going to be hard to find things to talk about. But I kept thinking, and up to this point, the things I had talked about had been, I'm in this really hard marriage, how do I relate to this? How do I do better on that? And it wasn't true anymore. We still had our bumps, but we had been consistently in a good place for quite a while. And I remember driving going, I don't have anything to talk about. That's different and weird, and I like it. I like it. What am I going to do? I remember going into my accountability group, and it was my turn to kind of, fill them in. And I'm like, gals, I don't know what to say. We're okay. We're okay. I've never been able to say that before, and it's been about, 10 years, but we're good. I love him. He loves me. And we're working things out. When things come up, we apologize. We keep short accounts. We don't fight like we used to. When we hit something, we take a break and we come back to it, and then we work it out. I don't have anything to report. I actually love you, but I don't need your help to figure out my life at this exact moment. And they rejoiced with me. And of course, I needed help again in the future, just not in the same. But that was like a pivotal turning point, because it was no longer I am a victim in a troubled marriage. How do we do this? It was we are normal 2 sinners living together, and we still have to figure that out. But it's not what it was. And it was really an amazingly pivotal worldview shift at that point.
And you really made a choice that night, if I remember the story right, that you made a choice to basically let me out of my box that I'd been in as the angry, abusive husband, to let me out of that box and release me into an unknown future.
Yeah, because I didn't know. If we're not this thing, what are we? We had to redefine both of our roles in that.
And when Timmy made that choice that night, she gave me a gift that I can never repay, because I'd earned that identity. I was that angry, abusive husband. I was that person. And she could have kept me in that spot forever and been justified in many people's perspectives in doing that. But she chose to let me out and trust grace and trust God for what the future might hold. And that was an incredible, incredible gift that you gave to me. So up to this point, as our journey is unfolding, while I'd been in pastoral ministry, like many guys, my identity had been tied up in my career. When 2 men meet for the first time, what are the first 2 questions they ask? What's your name and what do you do? Right? That's just the male way. It's what we do. I distinctly remember the day we were out at camp. I think we were speaking for a week or something, and it was partway through the week, and we're down at a ski show, and this person who's been there all week, but we haven't really interacted yet, comes up to me, and he says, "So," introduces himself, and then he asks the question, "So, what do you do?" And I looked at him, and I had this moment of incredible darkness for a man. I looked at him and I went, nothing. And I thought that was like the bottom of the barrel. I mean, but it was true. It was the truth. There was nothing else I could say. I was doing nothing. I didn't have a job. I'd looked and tried, but
Richie applied for 100 of jobs probably, because farming, by the way, not super lucrative.
the way we did it.
If we would have shot the deer that was eating our organic produce and sold organic venison, we would have made so much more money than like those 10 tomatoes that actually made it past the deer. That's a slight exaggeration, but not very much. No. So, yeah, but Richie had applied for a ton of jobs and couldn't even get a call. I mean, he's got almost 20 years of experience at camp, and he couldn't even get a call back to be the camp director's secretary. I mean, it was like God had put us in time out. People who we've been working with in ministry for decades, like none of them. He reached out to multiple people in different places in the world. He didn't get a call back from one person. Now, if it was one person not calling you back, you'd go, oh, they're busy. But when no one calls you back anywhere, ever, you just kind of assume God says, you're in time out and you need to stay there and be quiet, just like we tell our kids sometimes, until you've learned your lesson. And so after a while, we stopped trying. Not trying, but we switched our energies to different things. But at that point, Richie did have to answer, well, nothing.
Yep. And as time went on, the financial pressure grew, and so did the internal pressure. I remember walking down our driveway, looking up into heaven and saying, God, what do you want me to do? What are you trying to teach me here? Just speak. I'm listening. What do you want? And really wrestling with God. And both the Holy Spirit and my mentor continued to prompt me to focus my attention on pursuing my wife's heart. And more than a job, more than financial stability, I needed to win Timmy's heart and become safe for her emotionally. And we kind of have a one-sided view of what it means to be the provider for our family. That means I come home and I hand the paycheck over, right? That's kind of the stereotypical idea. But God was showing me that actually my wife needed me to provide emotional security and spiritual security and to be present actually emotionally and mentally and to be engaged with her and with our boys. And that was all part of providing for my family, not just bringing home a paycheck.
So, the reason we share all this is because, as I said before, we don't want you to think that God only works through quiet reflection. He also works through the crucible. And we certainly have gone through it multiple times, different crucibles for different seasons. And I don't know if I would have believed that what we had and what we were becoming was a real thing if it had been any easier than it was. We're both really stubborn, and we both have very hard heads. But experiencing Richie in the middle of this much chaos, it really was a moment of low darkness for him to say, nothing, I do nothing. And then he was still kind to me for the rest of the day. That really showed me that we were in a new place doing a new thing. And for him to be tender, even as he struggled and was frustrated, and to still be kind and still reach out to Caleb and I, really showed me that God was doing a different thing, a new thing. And, I would like to say that everything that we've brought up has now all been perfectly resolved. And we really are the picture-perfect couple of marvelousness. Which would be a lie, but a pleasant one. And because the reality is we've redefined what success is. We don't consider success a fightless marriage. We consider success that we fight really well now. We don't fight mean. And we come together pretty quickly most of the time. We also still ask for help pretty regularly. Richie doesn't meet with Jerry anymore. My accountability group has spread to the winds at this point. But we do have a counselor that we meet with twice a month because we are committed to growth. We never want to go, this is good enough. What we have is enough. My trauma still impacts our marriage. Richie's trauma still impacts our marriage. And we really are into freedom. And we're really we believe that God's redemptive work doesn't have a period at the end. And so we are fully committing to keeping going as long as we have breath and movement in us. And with that in mind, we want to end this talk with a song, actually. Can we have the back lights turned off so we can see the screen
Make
a
sure
little?
they got audio, do they?
Oh. And do we have audio? I hadn't thought of that from the PowerPoint.
Pushing.
That didn't
Sorry, we
even
forgot
occur to me to ask you. Because usually we're hooked up to my computer and then it just magically appears. Well,
It'll be coming off the PowerPoint.
it'll be coming off the PowerPoint, so it's actually embedded in the slide because it's a video in the slide. Don't you love a really climactic ending that kind of goes?
So well.
It was my fault. I should have told you guys.
She did once.
I did once.
She sang the song to
I
me.
surprised him with it once, but that takes some preparation. That's our last slide. That's us now. Yep. Yeah, I can push play on it. I just wanted to make sure you had audio. Oh,
Nope,
it
you
isn't.
can't. It may not work because of the switch.
We switched from Keynote to PowerPoint.
All right.
How about we do this? I can pull it up on YouTube, and we can start the next one with it. Why don't we just pray and end this, and then we'll...
Let me wrap up.
Richie's going to wrap up.
Yep.
Wrap
so
it up, babe.
Instead of wrapping up with a video, I think this is probably the most uncomfortable session for us. Did you stay awake? I thought you would. I checked in a couple times. Yeah, uh-oh. I'm sorry. This is probably the most uncomfortable session for us because we don't look very good in this, do we? I mean, yeah, we're pretty horrible and hateful. And you may wonder, well, why would you tell these stories then? And the reason we tell them, and we talked about it at lunchtime, but the reason we tell them is because God looks good in these stories. This is not about us looking good. This is about redemption. Because here's the deal. If God can take a self-righteous, stubborn, Seventh-day Adventist pastor like myself and get a hold of him and turn him around and take him from a 0 compassion score up to possibly as high as a 4, then there is great hope for everyone in this room. I remember after we'd started down this journey, as I was connecting with God, He prompted me one day that there was someone that I had treated poorly at summer camp years before, and I came under conviction that I need to reach out to this person and apologize for how I had treated them as staff. And so the only contact I had for them was on Facebook. And so I reached out to them on Facebook and I wrote a letter of apology. And their response was not exactly what I was looking for. Their response was simply, "Wow, Richie, I never thought God could get a hold of you." Which is not very affirming, but accurate. And so I just want to say that we tell these stories not because, as Timmy said, not because we're done, not because we got it all figured out, but because we serve a big God who's big enough to step into the muck and the mire and the mess that is us and bring something beautiful out of that. And if He can do that for us, He can do that for you. He can do that for anyone. So, Timmy, do you want me to just close with prayer? Okay. So let's just close with prayer, and then we'll take a little break, and we'll come back and see if we can show you this video. God in heaven, I want to thank you that you are big and powerful. And God, that you don't just show that by creating planets and stars, but that you demonstrate your amazingness and your strength and your power by changing hearts that are so hard and so smug and so broken. That you love us right where we are. You know the story. You know the backstory. And you like what you see. And you're willing to stay with us. You meant that promise when you said, "Behold, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world." You meant it. And so you walk beside us and you're offering yourself and you're making yourself available. And Lord, I just ask that today that I and each person in this room will just reach our hands up to you and say, "God, I need you with me right now. Would you change my heart? Would you teach me to love? Would you help me allow myself to be loved? God, we just want to open ourselves to you because you are the key to harmony and oneness. And we want to invite you to make that a reality in each of our lives. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So it is just about 4 o'clock. Why don't we come back at 10 after? We'll start, so we'll give you about 12 minutes to just get up and walk around, get a drink. And we'll come back at 10 after for our last session. And we're going to start with question and answer time. So if you've got questions, usually the questions pile up after we share our testimony. You can text them to the number on your workbook, or you can ask them into the microphone when we come back. For quite a few. Wow, most of you.
Yay, I'm glad we played it then, because that's a good one.
Yeah, Casting Crowns is just good stuff, but that particular song I just think is one of their best pieces. Actually, when I did more work for the radio station, I would track interviews with Christian artists, and when the lead singer for Casting Crowns, Pastor Mark, was talking about this song, he said, "I think this is the most important song on the album that they had released." He said this one is most important to us. So anyway, I think we're going to do questions at the end of this session. That way you guys have everything and you can ask your questions. So you're welcome to text them in now, but we'll do it at the end of this session. So we're going to do 10 tips, and then we'll take your questions, and then we're done. Does that sound fair? Is everybody still awake? Anybody need to do headstands or forward rolls down the aisle or anything? Just nope? Okay. All right. Just checking. You ready?
I am ready.
We are ready. So it was a little over a year into our journey towards healing and restoration when this happened. I had volunteered to lead a major outreach event at our church, this church, called Journey to the Cross. Anyone ever heard of that? Woohoo! Yeah. And so for 1 year, I was leading that charge. At the same time, we were getting ready for Journey to the Cross. I was also doing those depression recovery seminars at 3 different churches. And it seems like I had something else going on, too. Anyway, I was gone a lot of nights. It was kind of like I was pastoring again. And when all of these things came kind of closed up at about the same time and were done, Timmy and I had an emotional conversation. And she expressed in very clear terms that she was not happy with me. I had transgressed in some significant way. I don't recall what it was, but it was important. And I laugh every time I come to this, because our notes used to say, I could have gotten defensive. And we finally changed it, because the truth is, I got defensive. So I got defensive, and I argued that she wasn't being totally fair, and we went and started winding up, and finally I went for a walk to talk to God and complain to him about this woman that he had given me and how unreasonable she was being. And he actually interrupted my rant that particular evening and said, Richie, you haven't heard your wife. You need to go back inside and listen to her. And I'm like, yeah, but blah, 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 blah. And he cut me off and said, you need to go listen to your wife. And I went back inside and said, honey, I'm not really sure I've heard you completely yet. Can we try this again? What's the real issue here? And you said...
Well, we plowed back in, and while he was gone, being interrupted by God, I was having a similar experience in the house, and it was, you're complaining about all these things, but the real issue is you miss him. I don't miss him. He's being a jerk, actually. But again, that kind of gentle, no, actually, he's not home in the evenings anymore, and you miss him. And so when Richie came in and said, I'm not sure I've been hearing you well. Will you tell me again what's happening? Oh, I wanted to tell him all the ways he had transgressed. But what was true was, there's a lot of ways I'm frustrated with you, but that's because I miss you, and we don't see each other really at all anymore. And suddenly we're having a very different conversation, aren't we, than the one of a few moments ago of, well, you did this and this and this, and you're really a jerk, and blah, 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 you know, how things go down. And so suddenly we're having a different conversation.
And the reality is that this story illustrates is that Timmy and I can't go for very long without meaningful connection before our relationship starts to pay a price. Is that true for anybody else? Just us? Oh, you're back in your silent mode. I'm going to go to sleep. You guys need
I would just like to say there's one couple, she's nodding her head and he's shaking his head. I don't know what that means, but I like it. It's fun. It means job security.
So this session is designed to combat what, at least for me, is probably a never-ending challenge, which is that I will probably always be tempted to get more wrapped up in projects than relationship. And so the tips we're going to share in this session help to combat that and other challenges to our marriage relationships.
Yep. So this session is not going to be deeply theological. This is the really pragmatic. You know, we talked last night about how do we cleave to God so that we have a good foundation for the cleaving to each other. And then the practical tips for cleaving is, so how do we maintain a relationship together? And I can guarantee you that no matter where you are right now, there is at least one tip in here that would benefit you. Hopefully more than that, but I can pretty much guarantee that there's something in here that would be useful to you. And I want to invite you to not go home. We hope that you continue to think and talk about the things that you've been listening to for the last day and a half. But we would encourage you not to go home and say, okay, we're going to do tip 1, 4, 7, 9, and 10, and we're going to start tomorrow. Because if you do that, you're going to fail because that's too much. And then you won't like us anymore, and that would be sad because we really do like people. But more importantly, you wouldn't go, oh, wow, there was benefit to our time. And so we would invite you to take maybe one, talk about on the way home tonight, pick one thing from the list and go, let's give this a try for a week or 2 weeks, and then evaluate, is this helping, is it not? And then either pick a different one or add a different one so that you can, the goal of this is for you to have different tracks that you can run on so that your marriage is growing no matter where you find yourself. So if you're like, we're really struggling, I would say out of a 0 to 10, we're at about a 2. Well, let's see if we can get you to a 2.5 or a 3. And if you're an 8, what would it be? Wouldn't it be stunning to be at a 9? I mean, no matter where you are, there is movement in a positive direction.
Yep. So how many of you like making check-off lists? Like you're a list maker? Yeah, I love lists. In fact, one of the reasons I love Google Calendar is because you can put all these tasks up there and you can click them off as you go through the day, right? So I've been known to actually get partway through my day and realize, oh man, I've done these 5 things, and I'll go enter them into Google Calendar just for the joy of checking them off my list, all right? So
I agree. Shaking your head, no.
I am committed. I like practical steps in getting things done. So we like to talk about practical steps, but practical steps come with an inherent danger, and that danger is that we can listen to the list, and sometimes people who are list makers will say, hey, just give me the list. I can do that, right? What's the inherent danger in that statement? Ooh, yes, there's that. The other inherent danger, and you're right, absolutely. We tend to check it off. Yep, done that. The other inherent danger is I can do that, right? And I hope,
it's both.
if you haven't heard this message from us this weekend, we're slipping. I hope you've heard that we truly believe we need God at the center of everything to empower all of our emotions in relationship, or it doesn't work. So we just need God to make our families work, and that's the bottom line. We want to make sure that's out there right off the bat before we dive into our list.
So this list is 10 tips for cleaving, and this is not a list that we got out of a book. After we realized we'd been liking each other consistently for quite a while, we looked back and went, okay, so what's made a difference for us? And this is what we found helped us. We didn't set out to create a list. It was looking back, we said, oh, here's the things that were beneficial to us. So it's not exhaustive, of course, but these are the 10 things that we found were really, really helpful to help us begin to turn the corner and then stay a steady course.
So if you've got your workbooks, I think we've got places you can fill in all these in the list there. So number one is intentionality. Good things come with planning and focus. And for us, we mentioned that one of the big fights for us has been who owns time and how we handle time. So for us, intentionality meant working and reworking our schedule. And especially given some of my propensities to always be focused on projects and work, that meant reworking our schedule to focus it and make room for time for us. So guys, I tend to think this one lands on us, intentionality, and here's why I say that. When I read my Bible, God says in Genesis, I think chapter 3, he's talking to Eve. He said something really interesting. So after the fall, God looks at Eve and he says, and your desire shall be for your, what?
Husband.
Husband. Your desire shall be for your husband. Now, I have sometimes a simple approach to Scripture. I just kind of believe that when God says, this is how it is, I read it right there, I'm like, okay, that must be how it is. And I go looking for data to say, is that how it's working out? And the reality is, it's not 100%, it's not always like this every single time, but in most cases, most of the time, the woman in a relationship is more relationally focused than the man. Not always, but most of the time. Right? And so she's already thinking about the relationship. She's leaning in. She's the one saying, hey, honey, let's go to this marriage seminar. And he's like, why? We're good, right? Most of the time. So here's why I think this one lands on us guys, because God has already wired her. She's hardwired to be thinking relationally. We're the ones that are off like, no, we got to go conquer the world. We got to launch this business, whatever it is. And so some of you are laughing over, if we will take intentionality and take the initiative and say, honey, let's sit down and look at our schedule and make sure we're carving out time for date night. We're carving out time for family meal time. We're carving out time to just be together. She's going to move into that space. She's wired by God to do that. And so I think this one lands on us. But there's good news, men. Most of us already know how to make this happen in the marketplace, right? Because most of us, whatever your career is, whatever job you've worked at, you've probably gone through a process that looks something like this. You sit down as a team at work and you identify a challenge or a problem or an opportunity. And then you create a plan to meet the challenge or problem or opportunity. You implement the plan and then you evaluate the plan, tweak and repeat, right? If we take that same process and bring it home with intentionality, good things will happen in our marriages and our relationships. We know how to do this, guys. We have to choose to engage it.
So one of the things that it's helpful to be intentional about is time together. And this can look different for different couples, but it's really as simple as it sounds. Spend time together sometimes. Because most of us didn't get married because we hoped to never spend another quiet moment together alone. Right? But then we had kids, and that's a really distinct possibility, to never have another quiet moment together alone. And so it's not hard to not connect at a heart level. And so it's really important that we prioritize that we can connect at a heart level. And this isn't the time to talk about schedules and money and the dentist appointment and all those things. There is a place to talk about that, and we'll get to that one. It's not yet. I think it's number 5. But this is a part to talk about what you're happy about, what you're sad about. And I mean, I may talk about something that happened with the kids, but it's not because I'm brainstorming how to discipline child S later. It's so that I can process, okay, when they said that, it hit my buttons. I went from 0 to fury in about 2 seconds. What was going on in me? Because I don't actually usually go from 0 to fury in 2 seconds. So what was going on in me? And then, so we'll talk about that. You see the difference? Yes, we're talking about the kids, but we're talking about it from a context of my heart, not from a context of how do I make this child obey better, which is also a discussion that needs to happen, just not yet. So we have found that we can't go very long, like Richie said, without meaningful conversation, meaningful connection before seeds of bitterness start to plant and then sprout. And so What that can mean is that, remember how I said earlier when he had his office in the basement and he never left the house? That doesn't mean that we were having meaningful connection. It just meant he never left the house. And so there were more than a few times where we would go for days on end, we would see each other, but we wouldn't really connect in any kind of meaningful way. And I remember there was a couple times, especially during this season, where I'd be making dinner and I know that he's right beneath me. He can hear the chaos that is ensuing around me. I have 3 little humans who are very loud, always bent towards war, and they're circling the house, me in the house. And I am a buttress, I am a fortress, I am protection, I'm a weapon, I am what you run into as you are, because that's what it is living with little boys when you're trying to make dinner and their blood sugars are low. They're just, wah! And so in my head, I'm stirring the pot on the stove, and the chaos is circling. I don't like chaos at all. That's actually one nice thing about being a therapist. It's quiet, it's soothing. I get to control everything in my environment. Yeah. And so I've got all this chaos around me, and Richie's in his office. And notice in this story, we haven't communicated or really connected well for, let's say, 6 or 7 days. And the kind of thoughts that go through my head is, he can hear this, and he's laughing. He's laughing at the chaos that's happening. He could come up and help, but he's not, because he's awful. He doesn't care about me at all. He doesn't care. All he wants is food. He doesn't, and the tapes, they just go, and they get bigger, and they get bigger. They have no basis in truth. But it's what's in my head, because when we are connected emotionally, you know how that conversation would actually go? The chaos is mounting. Richie should be here. I could just go downstairs and ask him if he would come up 5 minutes early for dinner so that he can keep the creatures happy and out of the kitchen, and I can just finish. That whole big story that I was telling myself doesn't have to happen. But when the seeds of bitterness form from lack of meaningful connection, those are the kind of stories that get blown up in our heads because we don't have the data to fight it, if that makes sense. So it's really important to have time together so that seeds of bitterness do not grow.
That's right. And this can look different ways. We know people who maybe they have a walk time every day. It's their time. They go for a walk at the same time every day, or they go sit on a swing and talk. One of the best gifts we ever got, besides the back porch on the house that we were building, we had some family who said, we're going to build the back porch for you. And then we had this really cheap, squeaky deck chair.
It was a hand-me-down.
And we would put the kids to bed, and we'd crack the window open a little bit to the living room, and we'd sit out there on the deck and watch the moon rise over Mount Spokane, and we'd talk and talk and talk for hours out there. It was great. So it doesn't matter how you do it. For us today, I think probably it looks like most nights, the kids go to bed and we talk. We live in a place where we don't have television, we don't have internet.
Like we don't have a choice.
It's not even an option.
Because we would have chosen it if we would have had a choice, let's be honest.
And that actually would have been too bad.
Yes.
Because we're so much better off without it.
Yes.
Because we have no media options. The kids go to bed, and we do one of two things. We read or we talk. So for most nights, we spend probably a couple hours just sitting and talking and sharing about what's going on heart to heart. Now, there are a couple rules that we need to lay out for this connecting time. And ladies, this first rule really applies mainly to you. It's called the no dumping rule, all right? And it's basically this. The research has shown that you ladies tend to have more words and thoughts and ideas that you need to get off of your chest, right, than we do. We have a limited supply there, and many times by the time we get home from work, they're gone. Poof, they're done, right? And so what can happen...
That is so not true of you.
Not of me. No, I'm not average in that way. I'm making up for lost time. I used to have no feelings, and now I have lots because I've been working at it for years.
It's true.
So, yeah, that's another story we could tell. But so what can happen is that ladies, you can start to have a backlog begin to grow and grow and grow, and it's just there's no place to get that out and get it expressed, and that can begin to lead to some bitterness and some pent-up emotions. And so what can happen is Well, you can go to like a marriage seminar and hear this idea that, you need to connect heart to heart. And so on the way home from the marriage seminar, he may look over at you with the best of intentions and a smile on his face and say, honey, how's your heart? And you look at him and go, you want to know how my heart is? I'll tell you how my heart is. And you just let him have the whole thing. He is never coming back, all right? I'm just telling you. So if he asks, just give him a little bit, right? Kind of reminds me of a story I heard. A young pastor, he just gotten out of seminary, Pastor Teddy. He was in his first district, probably up in Eastern Washington somewhere, and it was a rural district, and he walks into his church, first weekend in his new church here, and he walks in, and there's only one person sitting in the sanctuary. It's this old farmer sitting on a wooden bench towards the back, and the young preacher thinks, man, what do I do now? They never told me anything about this in seminary. So he walks up and he sits on the front row. And every once in a while he'd look over his shoulder and nobody else comes in. So finally he gets up and he walks back to the old farmer and he says, well, what do you think? And the old farmer looks at this young pastor and he says, well, I don't know much. But if I go out to feed my cows and only one cow shows up, I feed her. So the young preacher says, all righty then, and he walks back up to the pulpit, he opens up his Bible, he pulls out the notes to his best seminary sermon, and he just lets it go. Both barrels flying, sweat going, and he just delivers the sermon of a lifetime. And when he finishes, he says amen, closes his Bible, and walks to the back of the sanctuary, and he waits. The old farmer gets up kind of slow and makes his way towards the door, and when he gets to the door, the young preacher sticks out his hand, and he says, well, what'd you think? The old farmer says, well, I don't know much, but if I go out to feed my cows and only one cow shows up, I don't give her the whole load. So ladies, don't give him the whole load. You want to keep him coming back. Keep that conversation awake.
Number 3, mentors. We found marriage mentors to be so pivotal to the health and healing of our marital relationship that when we were faced with a decision between gainful employment and direct deposit and to keep our marriage mentor community going, we actually chose our marriage mentor community. And even looking back, that decision brought a lot of suffering with it. And we wouldn't have made a different choice looking back at this point, because who in their right mind would choose poverty? But on the other hand, choosing to intentionally focus on our marriage with other people who are wise and entering in with us was really important and life-saving, I would say. And so, we wouldn't have it any other way. So if you can find another couple who is farther down the road than you are, and preferably has experienced some of the same things, it is life-changing. There is a list, because Richie likes lists, on page 24 in your workbook that talks about how do you even find a marriage mentor couple. And, if you have questions about this, when we get to the question and answer at the end, feel free to ask. But, there have been times where we needed more support in our relationship. And, we just started praying about it. God, who would you bring to us? And then we would pursue the ideas that came. And sometimes those worked out really well. And sometimes it worked well for a while and then not as well. But the reality is, at least in our experience, God has always been faithful to bring us who we need within a general timeline of when we need it. Obviously, if I have a problem, I need an answer now, and it's possible the answer won't come for 3 or 4 months. But in the overall timeline of things, God has always brought who we needed when we needed it. And especially in this ICU phase of our marriage, they were absolutely life-saving. And another thing I want to put into this category before Richie adds a couple more things is this idea of ICU. I have talked to more than a few couples where in all Christian love, I want to shake them and say, you are in ICU. Your marriage is in ICU. No, if our child was in ICU, we would get the best doctors. We would make sure they had whatever kind of care they needed so that they would stay alive. But how often we do not put that kind of energy into our marriages when they are in ICU. They're going to die unless there is a really, really serious movement and shift. And so I don't know any of your stories, but I would implore you to consider, if your marriage is in ICU, act like it. Look for resources, look for humans, look for counselors, look for mentors, look for books. Do not just let it die. And maybe you're in a place where you're like, it's fine, it's good enough. That's just the first stage of death, or maybe the last stage of death. I think it's actually a stage on both sides. But again, if you don't really like coming home to the person that you live with, do something. I invite you, I implore you, I beseech you. Don't let it just be okay. Act like death is imminent and act accordingly.
And you might be wondering, well, what do you mean by ICU? I remember when I was in the delivery room with Timmy for one of our children. And
It was the first.
It was the first. And all of a sudden,
I remember.
The process had been going on for some time, and it was coming slowly.
About 22 hours.
Very, very slowly. And then all of a sudden, the room filled with medical staff. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on? Well, what was going on was a doctor had been monitoring. They'd put a probe in so that they could monitor the baby's oxygen level, and they were seeing the oxygen level drop. And they knew that baby had to come now. And so all of a sudden, we had every available medical resource in the room ready to deliver this baby right now because he was on the edge of being in trouble. That's what it means, folks, to take this seriously. You get all the resources you can possibly bring to bear on your relationship. When Timmy said we were spending 8 to 10 hours a week as a couple working on our marriage, that's what ICU meant for us. That's what it took. That's what we needed. We had our main marriage mentor couple. They adopted us for an entire year. We spent every holiday with their family at their table, sharing the meal and their way of doing whatever it might be, which made for some pretty interesting memories, actually. As we have veggie loaf on one end of the table and spiraled ham on the other. But you know what? We walked away from some of those holidays, and Timmy would look at me and say, wow, is that what Christmas can be like when it's not all entangled with family drama and all these things? And just being with them cast this amazing vision. And their kids, who were teenagers, when we started spending, a night every other week with them, they'd take Caleb downstairs and they'd go play with him while we talked. When their kids graduated from high school, and when they had other family events, we have been invited to almost weddings. We've been invited to almost all of them. And when their kids introduce us to their friends, they say, these are some of our dear friends. That's how they always introduce us. We love these people. And they poured into us. And I would just encourage you, find a couple that has a marriage you like the looks of and pray about it and invite them and say, could you be a place where we can talk about the real stuff? Can we have some real conversation? Or maybe you're a couple, you're saying, actually, we've been through some of this stuff, but we're doing good. We've got some traction. God is blessing. Then look around and ask God, who could you grab by the hand and offer that same mentoring experience to? And just say, let's go. And there may be other ways you can do it even here at the church, and we can talk about that later.
I really believe that we need to get back to being a storytelling people. To be able to tell our testimonies, even when they're not super shiny, especially when they're not super shiny, so that other people, I think about what it would have been for me as a 21-year-old pastor's wife if I would have heard someone share a testimony that included marriage being hard. And I didn't even have categories to think about what we were experiencing. I just knew it was really hard and it really hurt, and sometimes I wanted out. I didn't know that there was some sense of normalcy of what we were going through and that there was hope at the other side. So if we can get back to being a storytelling people for the purpose of helping other people along, I think that would benefit us as a group. And it would give other people coming in hope that they are in good company and that we aren't the shiny people and they have to shine it up if they're going to fit in with us. So enough of that. Number 4. Purposeful enrichment. The fact that you have sat through many hours of us talking now says that you have made a good step on purposeful enrichment. Thank you very much. When we got married, we set a goal of doing at least one marriage enrichment type experience every year. And while we haven't done that every year, it is so important, and I actually think we do a lot at this point, not just what we're talking, but the purpose of purposeful enrichment is to put it on the calendar and make it happen. It could be reading a book and talking about. It could be doing an online curriculum. There are so many of those these days. It really isn't so important as what you do, is that you do something. That's why the purposeful, you do it on purpose. Enrichment, you are going to do something to add nourishment to your relationship.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways you can go at it, and I don't know what your church may do here or wherever you may attend regularly, but there's lots of different curriculums, and Timmy and I even have created a video curriculum that right now I think there's enough videos in there that you could watch a video a week for 7 months. And they're about 20 to 30 minutes each one, and you could form a small group. We've had churches that just formed a class that met on Saturday morning and would go through it, and we've gotten great responses back from those churches in various parts around North America. So there's different ways to do it. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you do something. Research has actually shown, this is really fun, that's why it's fun to be married to a counselor. Research has shown that people who simply pick up the phone, call a counselor, and make an appointment, they haven't gone, they've just made an appointment, that they report an increase in marital satisfaction. All they've done is make an appointment to see the counselor, and they're feeling better about their marriage, right? So do something. It doesn't actually matter what you do. Do I think some things are more valuable than others? Of course. But do something. That's what it means to be purposeful in enriching your marriage. Oh, number 5, family meetings. This is a fun one. So some of the best advice we ever got from a counselor was the idea of family meetings. Now, we talked about sharing time is that heart-to-heart connecting time. Family meetings is the business meeting for our family. So what this does is for all of you that raised your hands and said you're a list maker like Richie, this is the place where the list maker knows that on a regular basis we're going to get together and talk about the business of the family. And for the list maker, this makes a huge difference, because if Timmy looks at me and says, "Honey, how's your heart?" and my brain's going, "Oh, did you make that appointment to get the car in? Do we get what day are we getting the tires changed on that?" My brain's going through all the list stuff. I can't set that stuff down to focus on connecting emotionally. But if I know we're going to deal with that at our family meeting on Sunday morning, I can go, okay, taken care of, and there it is. Now, when we started doing the family meeting, I take this very seriously. We had a printed agenda, all right?
He
Sunday
had a
morning,
printed
family
agenda.
meeting, printed agenda, because I could check it off that way. It's important. So we don't do that anymore. That is how we started.
Who has time for a printed agenda on a weekly basis?
Yeah, we didn't have kids then, so we had
Yes,
time for a printed
it's
agenda.
true.
Now we have kids, no printed agenda. So how we do it now, we have our touchdown pretty much most mornings. I handle breakfast in the morning routine in our house. Timmy doesn't prefer to be awake. And so she'll typically come down about the time we're finishing breakfast, and then we're getting ready to head out the door to school. And so we look at each other and it's kind of a quick touchdown. Hey, are you taking care? What do you got? What's your schedule? What time are you done with work today? Those kind of things. We handle that, and boom, we're out the door and we're gone. Family meeting done. Occasionally we'll say, hey, we really need to take some time and sit down and talk about vacation or this ministry trip or whatever it is. And then we plan a time to sit down and do that. But having that as part of our routine allows me to kind of set down that and know, okay, it'll be dealt with, and then I can focus better when we're connecting in the evenings.
Yep. Number 6, couple prayer time. Praying together as a couple isn't something that we did for many, many years, and it's something that we started more, I would say, halfway through our kind of turnaround. And there's something that happens when you touch skin to skin and then pray together. There's something about the deep burdens and joys on your heart kind of surface together. And this is kind of a silly thing, but we found a litmus test is it comes time to pray, if I don't want to hold his hand, there's something we need to talk about before we pray. So again, it's kind of silly, but, it does create a really good litmus test because there's something we need to work through and resolve so that we feel like that level of intimacy matches where we are relationally. And because it is very intimate to pray together, to invite God into that space, to close your eyes with the other like that, it really does create intimacy and deepens intimacy. And so it's something, when you think about cleaving together, if it's something you haven't tried, you might want to consider it.
Yep, it's powerful stuff. In fact, when we're talking to young people, we talk about prayer, we actually say to young people, we say, you know what, prayer is such an intimate experience and such a powerful experience that we encourage you to pray in groups until you're married. Because we know too many young people who love the Lord, who found themselves intimate in ways they didn't intend to be because they were being intimate spiritually. It's a powerful bonding agent, and so encourage you to consider that as something to add to your routine if that's not part of your routine. Next up is family fun time. Now, in our house, Timmy's just more fun. That's just reality. Mommy is more fun, and Daddy is still working at it. But we heard people talk about family fun time, and we thought, yeah, we should maybe try that. And so we tried it for a while, and then we kind of drifted out of it until our, what was he then, 11-year-old said, we don't do family fun time anymore, Mom and Dad. And we're like, ooh, he's right. So we've been more intentional. I think we're on the edge of falling off the wagon again right now, if confession were to be made right here.
It's the real reason we're giving this, so we can be reminded that we're not necessarily stellar.
Yeah, I don't really want to continue on this one right now. So what family fun time has meant, we're raising boys. So you know what? Fun for boys involves conflict and warfare, right? So if it's a pillow, a stick, a Lego, we're going to throw it, whack it, hit it, something. Our kids were playing just a couple days ago down in our barn, and it's a perfectly good barn, but what did they want to do? They were using it as a fort, and they were pulling up giant-sized weeds and hurling them at each other through the windows and cracks, and I don't exactly understand the game that they were playing, but it was fun.
But it ended in tears, because all good games have to end with someone being hurt.
Well, not necessarily, but
they do, though.
Good. Yep. So for us, that means pillow fights. I think our kids' favorite still, laser tag's a cool one that our kids enjoy.
Because where else do you get to run through the field shooting at your children? Unless you're playing laser tag.
I was talking about our kids enjoying it, but...
Oh, no. This is full family fun. No, we literally set up the whole barn to be a laser tag course. This is good stuff.
Yep. I think our kids' favorite game still... this may be the last year this is true. I don't know. We're moving into the teen years, but they love hide and go seek in the dark.
In the house.
So we live in an old farmhouse. We turn out all the lights in the house, and the people who are doing the looking get the flashlight. Everybody else goes and hides, and then the lookers count to 100 or whatever it is, and then start searching. And our youngest is a really good hider. He can fit, well, not as small a space as he used to, but he can handle confined spaces with no sound. He's very difficult to find.
Long periods of time.
Yeah. Now, Timmy, if she knows we're going to play, she will scout for days in advance and literally create hiding places. And then what do you do?
Because if you do it a few days before, they don't know that you've rearranged things for this. So we've got 5-gallon buckets that we keep rice and beans and that kind of stuff in. And I will just move them out the day before or the morning of, so they're already used to it being there. So there's enough space for me to hide behind it. And then I win every single time. No competitiveness in our household.
That's right. Yeah.
Actually, it all comes down to, I know this is family fun time, but that's a way to get mommy alone time during family fun time, which is a win-win.
Yep, and our kids are getting old enough that now board games and table games are getting to be fun.
That's true.
Good times.
And you may be saying, well, we don't have kids at home. Okay, you don't need to have kids at home to still have fun together. Because especially if you're in a rough patch relationally, it's even more important that you're having fun together. Because when you're in a stressful relationship or in a stressful patch in your relationship, the cortisol, the adrenaline, those stress hormones are being released into your system. And so it's important to have some positive chemicals being released into your system as well. So if you can do something and laugh together, then that's going to help on the bonding standpoint. so that you have something to offset. So the more stress you have, the more fun you need to be having as well to help offset that biochemically.
Okay.
So number 8 is a forgiveness process. And we have a worksheet in here, and you may have noticed that I'm not really keen on formulas. We haven't given you any yet. This is not a formula. This is a process. Big difference. And the reason I say that is I find that formulas never work for me, so I'd hate them. And so what I have found, though, is to have a framework so you know some of the basic concepts of what you're trying to accomplish is helpful. So if you want to turn to page 18 in your workbook, this is a process, a framework that we have put together so that you can have some ideas of what we're talking about here. And we're gonna, Richie's gonna say a few moments about what forgiveness is, and then we're going to share a little bit about how we've done it with this process. And while we don't have to open up a workbook anymore, this is still the process that we go through, I would say multiple times a week, because we're still human. And so that we can keep short accounts, because that's really important relationally.
So we have a problem as Christians in that we do not understand forgiveness in a biblical format, right? We teach and practice forgiveness as something that is nowhere found in Scripture. So here's how we do it. If you're raising kids, and in our case, we'll just pick on a couple of kids, think of our own boys. But if you've got Bobby and Frankie, and they get into a fight, and Frankie clocks Bobby, and you come and break up the fight, you look at Frankie and you say, Frankie, you need to say, I'm what? Sorry. And Frankie, he's still mad, and he's still hot, and he'd like to get one more good punch in. He scuffs the ground, he says, I'm sorry. And then you look at Bobby and you say, Bobby, you need to say what? I forgive you. And Bobby says, I forgive you. Now, what did we just teach these two kids? We taught them denial. We taught them to lie, right? Because they're not sorry, right? Yeah, I remember when I was in second or third grade. I have a lot in common with our oldest. I got in trouble because I wrote a not nice note to a girl in my classroom, and I got sent to the principal's office, and he wanted me to apologize. And I looked him in the eye and I said, I'm not apologizing. I meant every word. Now that's integrity. I was wrong, but that's integrity, right? But here's the deal. We're teaching, and here's the most important thing we're teaching Bobby and Frankie, and that many, if not all of us in this room have bought into. We're teaching them that forgiveness is a cognitive, mental transaction, right? I choose to forgive you. There, we're done. I'm good. You're good. Let's move on. How's that work for you? Here's the evidence that it doesn't work. How many of you, just raise your hand, how many of you have ever found that you had some blow up, argument, fight, or just major mistake in your marriage, and you sat down after a while and you said sorry and I forgive you, and then months or even years later you get into another argument and you hear yourself or your partner saying, you always do that, it's just like that one time, and it comes up again. How many of you have ever had that happen? You said sorry, but it keeps coming up. Why? Why is it coming up? If it's forgiven, why is it still boiling inside of you and conflict brings it out? Because your body and your mind clearly understand that this is not done. Here's the issue. The challenge is that we do emotional, relational harm, and we process forgiveness as a cognitive transaction. It can't work. It cannot. Only an emotional process of forgiveness can heal an emotional, relational wound. Right? We have to actually experience in ourselves the pain, the hurt, the grief, the disappointment, whatever it is, and from that place offer an emotional, relational forgiveness. And that is when it's done. So we're going to teach you a process that was taught to us. We've modified a little bit from our friend Pastor Gary, who taught this to us. And this has literally transformed our healing journey. Because here's what happens. When we get into relationship, let's just imagine that this space in front here is our relational living room. Every time you have a fight or a conflict and there's any piece of that that's left undone, right? So you may say sorry, but it's a cognitive thing. Then you just start getting more and more rubble piling up in the middle of your relationship. And so every time you're trying to work things out, you're tripping over all the garbage in the living room. And what we need is a process to move it out, to clear the rubble away so that we can truly have a level playing field and be able to work each issue out on its own merits.
So one of the things that we did, and this was not the first thing we did in our kind of marital journey towards healing. I would probably say this came a ways into it because we wouldn't have been ready to do it right at the beginning because we didn't have enough communication skill at that exact moment, but we gained it with practice. But the purpose, like Richie said, is to remove the relational debris from the marriage room. And so one of the things you can do, and this is what's outlined here on page 18, is for each person to make a list of these are the things I need to forgive you for. So, I don't know, we both had 10 or 15 things on our lists of what we needed to forgive the other for. And then we prioritized it. So kind of gave it a Richter scale rating from like 0 to 10. And, this is the worst thing you've ever done to me. This is a 10. This one, on the overall scheme of things, was only a 3, and just kind of give them a rating system. Not because it matters at all, but because you don't want to pick the worst thing. You don't want to start with the worst thing that they ever did to you, and then start there, because it'll be a landmine. You'll just blow yourselves up. But then you have to find time, that goes back to intentionality, where you can have at least an hour to start processing. That means, if you've got a show on, it's being recorded, phones are off, kids are abed or, away. And so that you can stick with the process. And it's important, we're gonna actually just walk it through, and it's gonna be dorky. Let's just put that out there. This is a real story that happened to us, but anytime you reenact a real story, it's dorky. So we'll just hold that and be okay with it. But what's important as we show you the process, which is number 5 on page 18, is that whenever you start a process of, well, you did this and it hurt me, the other person often wants to say, well, that's not what I meant to do. That's, you took it wrong. That actually doesn't matter for this process, because even if that is not how you intended the thing to go down, the other person received your words as harsh or your actions as insensitive, so defending yourself and saying, but that's not what I meant. There is a time for that, but it's not during this process. This process is, you hurt my heart. I need you to care that you hurt my heart, even if it's not what you meant to do. Does that make sense? Enough? We'll see if it makes sense by the end. So I'm going to be person number 1, and Richie's going to be person number 2. And as a side note, on the next 2 pages, on page 20 and 21, there's a feeling words sheet, because even with Richie being a pastor and someone who specializes in words, and me being a therapist also specializes in words, when we get hot, we don't have a lot of feeling words. And so this, a different version of this list was sitting next to our bed for about 2 years so that we could use it when we needed to. Because you need to have ideally more feeling words than frustrated, angry, and irritated, because that's only one category. So Richie's going to be person number 2. I'm person number 1. Okay. This is a real honest-to-goodness story. So, hey, Richie, I'm wondering if we can talk about what happened last night. It's a figurative last night. This did not really happen last night.
In front of all these people?
Right, exactly.
Sure.
Yeah. So the other night, I came to you to talk about family fun time, and your response was that family fun time was over until you finished your project. And I needed to just go take care of the kids and let you be so you could do your project. And you were pretty just irritated in general.
So How did that affect you when I said that and the way I said that?
My first response was to be very angry because that's not how we treat each other anymore. But then as I kept thinking about it, fear started to rise because we used to treat each other like that, and I was afraid that maybe we were going back to that because I was feeling the feelings of hurt and being sidelined and dismissed, and like I was in charge of the kids. That was my job, and your job was to do whatever you wanted, and I didn't have a say in anything. And I had a lot of fear and a lot of frustration rise at the same time.
So I'm hearing you say that when I responded that way, it created a lot of fear, like we were going back to the bad old days, a lot of anger and frustration, powerlessness. Mm-hmm. You felt like you didn't matter, the kids didn't matter, I was just, only my project mattered. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else?
I didn't use the word powerlessness, but now that you brought it up, absolutely. Yes, I did feel powerless because it wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a, hey, I've got this problem, how can we fix it? It was just kind of an authoritarian, arbitrary, this is how it's going to be, now deal with it. And I haven't felt that way with you in a long time. And it was scary. It was scary to feel that kind of distance and separateness from how we have started making decisions together. And it was a big one because it affects all of us.
So really a lot of fear.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of fear about where I might be going internally. A lot of fear that maybe the progress we've made is going to be lost in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything more?
No, that about sums it up.
Timmy, yeah, I did respond that way, and I was pretty stressed. And I just want you to know that's not who I want to be. You and the boys are more important than the project, and I'm feeling a lot of pressure to get that done. But I'm sorry that my actions and my words and my tone of voice left you feeling fear and anxiety and powerlessness and frustration. And I just wonder if right now, where you're really connected to all of that, if you would forgive me for behaving that way.
I will.
Thank you.
And what was sweet about this when we did it in real life, as opposed to in front of all y'all, is that what came next in the conversation was, he's like, I really am stressed about this project, though. I really do have a deadline. And because, I mean, the reality is we do have real life happening. And so we were able to brainstorm because suddenly we're on the same team. It's not him against me. And so I was able to come in to the situation and say, okay, so what is it you have to get done? And he told me the different parts. I'm like, I could do this and this part. Could you come and we could all spend an hour together just hanging out and playing, and then as soon as we get the boys to bed, I will help you for the rest of the evening. And we actually got it done before the deadline. But again, it was because we were able to work together as opposed to me being exiled to a different part of the house with the kids. And that's what happens when we're able to re-engage. Because I mean, on one hand, this is a small thing. I would put this not even on the Richter scale. But these are the things that piled on top of each other creates big walls between people. And that's why it's important to start untangling these. And the other thing I wanted to throw in before we move on to the next point is that there's a difference between grief and unforgiveness. Because there are times when we have had a bigger problem between us where I can forgive him and mean it and still be hurt. But the difference is, I think, in attitude, because if I am being unforgiving, I am likely moving towards contempt. That's just my normal. And if I'm in grief, I'm still soft, I'm hurt, I'm not in some form seeking to get him back. Can you feel the difference between that? Unforgiveness is different than grief. So you can say, I forgive you, and still be hurt, as long as your hurt is not trying to attack or revenge in any way.
And I would just say this process, while it feels kind of hokey, we've actually done a video series teaching this process, and we've heard from people around the world. I'm thinking of one couple in particular and across the country who emailed us and said, we've had an issue that we haven't been able to get past for 4 years. We watched these videos, we went through the process, it's done. This is, for us, most of the things that we have run through this process, they never come up again.
It's true.
So there's no more a year later, well, you always, nope, it's gone. It's done. And this is a powerful,
And that's
powerful
because it was
process.
an emotional engagement, not just a mental engagement. And for me, I can tell the difference because if you look at my husband's head, he has a furrow right here. And when he's not engaged emotionally, it scrunches up. And so if he's scrunched when we're talking, I know he's actually not connecting to me at all. So when it relaxes, I know that we're connecting. He says that's really unfair. But it's a true statement. And you might not be able to say there's that one wrinkle on the left eye, and that's what it means. But you can sense the difference when your beloved is connecting with you and when they're not. And that's why if you go into this process and you just can't make progress, it likely means that you need help to get it off the ground. So again, that takes you back to either a counselor or a marriage mentor or someone who can help facilitate the process while you're learning a new skill. This is a new skill. I'm willing to say most of you were not raised with some kind of a forgiveness process that includes wounding and repair. So you don't speak this language naturally, which is fine. You can learn a new skill, and your marriage will be the better for it.
And some of you may be sitting here going, I don't know where you'd find any example of that in Scripture. I don't know where you guys get this idea. Well, let me just give you one example that is pretty meaningful to me. When Jesus hung on the cross, he was there, arms outstretched, spikes through his hands and ankles, lacerated head, lacerated back, struggling to breathe. And then we're told he's feeling the full weight of all the sins of the world on his person. Absolute, complete, and total weight of sin on his person. And it's in that place, when he's fully engaged with the cost of sin, that Jesus from the cross looks down and says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. That's my model. That's my example. That it's when we are fully connected to the cost of what we have experienced, then we are in a place when we can give a true relational forgiveness.
I'm going to do number 9, you do number 10?
Deal.
Okay. Oh, that's what we just did, sorry.
There it is, there it went.
So number 9 is time in nature, time together in nature. And maybe this is not the same for all of you, but we find that it is definitely a bonding experience to be in nature with each other, with our kids. My kids are not as loud in nature as they are in closed buildings. That helps. But we find that, when we are in nature, and we see a moose, or an elk, or the turkeys, or the geese, or the pelicans.
Or an elk hide.
No. I'm sure it'll be bonding before it's done, but I don't actually consider a pelt on my grass time in nature. So, different topic. Anyways, it's my color. But there's just something, and I'm sure that there's a biochemical, there's a book called Back into the Woods or something like that I'm sure talks all about it. But there's something about the rest that we find when we are in nature that changes us. It changes us. And it is a way to cleave to each other. Going on a hike with your beloved, going for a drive in a place like Glacier. When we experience nature, I think there's just something about going back to God's creation that is a bonding chemical, a cleaving, both to Him as well as each other. And that's something that we found was really helpful. Even though we live in the middle of absolutely nowhere, which is only 2 miles from town, isn't God good like that? Because we're not going to tell the rest of that story. But right now, we live in a place that's 2 miles from, well, if you consider Fairfield town, and I do, there's real humans there who talk to me and know me by name, so that counts. And Richie can't see the lights from anyone else's property. Who knew that God created such places? And they don't get internet, so you have to talk to each other. So it's really a good thing. So even though we live in a place that most people would call nature, we find going to the woods is really, really good for our whole family. And we are calmer, we are better humans after spending time in nature. And if we are better humans, we love better too. So it really does increase our oneness when we go on little mini adventures together.
Number 10, here we are. Number 10 is dreaming together. So for Timmy and I, we have discovered that sharing our dreams is a really powerful bonding experience. And a lot of times when our kids were younger, this was more true. Now we're finding new routines. But it used to be that we'd get in the car, the wheels would start turning, we'd be driving to some speaking appointment like this, and the kids would fall asleep, and we'd start talking. And I remember we were driving through the Columbia Gorge years ago. Timmy had just attended a seminar on brain development, and we started talking, and we made our decision that based on the latest research and what we knew of our children, we were going to start with homeschool. And that was an important dreaming together. I remember another trip somewhere between Goldendale and home when we dreamed some really powerful, amazing dreams for our ministry. And between, Boise and home came up with a whole new way of teaching on videos together. And we've had different talks about our marriage and our parenting and all these things. And for us, that just dreaming about our future together really draws us together because we get excited about a future that we're both looking forward to and a project that we're excited about pulling off. And there's something really, really connecting there that we connect with each other at a deep level. And I look forward to our future together when we're dreaming together.
You know, the Bible says that without a vision, the people perish. I think that's true maritally as well. If you don't have a common vision of what you're striving towards, preferably beyond just keeping the children alive, though that's an important goal too, you have to have something shared, something that you're like, no, we are working on this thing. It could be a project. It could be a saving towards a vacation. there's a lot of things it could be, but to have something that you're sharing together that are moving you in a synergistic way together in the same direction is really, really important from a cleaving standpoint.
Well, our time together is coming to an end.
You made it. Good job, gang.
If you're survivors, you should get the T-shirt in the back. Says I survived the weekend with the Browers.
There's no shirt in the back.
There should be, though. We just want to leave you with this, that no equation for a happy marriage that does not include Jesus at the center will ultimately work. You can take these 10 steps and start implementing 1 or 2 or 3, but without Jesus and the Holy Spirit empowering those choices and those decisions, it's not going to get the results that you desire. This doesn't happen by accident. It takes steady, determined, intentional action over time is what builds the kind of marriages that we want to live in. And so we want to leave you with a challenge. I'd like to leave with a little bit of my voice. And we want to challenge you to not walk away from this weekend checking a box, list checkers, that you've done your part for marriage for the year. We want to give you one last assignment. If you look in your workbook, it's on page 8, it looks like.
No, it's not.
No, it's
That's
not.
a
It's
lie.
been moved. The workbook has been revised. There is a sheet in here called the roadmap.
Page
on
16.
Page 16. This would be a great follow-up. So tonight, as you leave, you can, find your way down the street to Froyo or somewhere else. Just find a quiet place to sit down and talk together. Don't let too much time get away, or you'll just forget this and move on without it. But sit down and take some time to go through the roadmap and say, what steps do we want to take? Let's be proactive. Let's commit ourselves to some things. What do we want to do to keep moving forward? And like Timmy said earlier, maybe you're looking at each other and going, man, this is a wreck. On a scale of 1 to 10, we're at a 2. Well, okay, you're not going to be a 10 next week, okay? Let's just be honest. But you could be a 2.5 or a 3. So what steps could you take as a couple that would move you down that road? The roadmap is designed to help you design a strategy to move forward. So there's discussion questions in your workbook that we haven't given you time to go through. I know there's a lot of material you've heard, but you could even set up times and just say, you know what, in the next week, let's just take half an hour each night and go through one discussion question together. But you can walk away from this and go, yep, we learned some good stuff. But if you really want to get the most out of your time, get the maximum return on your investment, then continue to use this resource and others that may be available to you and maximize this by talking and planning what's our strategy to move forward and take the next step in our marriage.
I agree.
Good. Would you like to pray?
Sure.
Let's pray, and then we're going to take your last questions. So now is the chance to text them or raise your hand in a moment.
Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the time that we have been able to spend here. I thank you for those who have made it possible, for our caterers, for our child care, for our facility and PA people. You have provided so much for us. And God, as we go forward from here, I ask that you will deepen our desire, that you will make us long for more of you and more of each other, that we will not be satisfied, that we won't let pride get in the way and say, well, I don't need anyone else's help, when maybe we do. God, move us, shake us, and let us know that you are an alive God who is still on your throne, and there is still hope for us. Jesus, strengthen those who are weary that are here. Thank you for being with us and for going out with us as well. Amen.
Amen. Okay, this is your time. So
Right, give me your
I'm
phone.
checking my device to see if we have any questions that have come in. Does anybody want to raise their hand and ask again? You know the rules. You can ask absolutely anything you want. If we don't know the answer, we'll say, I don't know. And if it's something we maybe not. Anybody? Are you just stunned?
I think if you need to stand up and move because all the blood has settled in your ears, feel free.
Yep. Anybody have any last questions? Just say, man, I really want to know. Perfect.
I think we
we
stunned
covered
them
every
into
single base. That makes me
silence.
so incredibly happy.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, then we just want to thank you for coming and honoring us with your presence.
Yes.
We realize you've taken a ton of your time to be here last night and today and to stay awake and be smiling and alert and interactive, which makes our job easier and more fun. So thank you. This has been fun for us, and we appreciate the chance to be back here in the Valley Church and to be with all of you. So I'm going to turn it over to whoever starts moving towards the stage first. The mic is yours. That's you.
Hey, you all do look stunned, just saying. You look kind of stunned, but it's okay. I'm so thankful for both of you for just spending time with us and sharing with us and just giving insight into this, I believe, sacred institution that God has given us. It's such a blessing in our lives, and thank you for doing that for us. I just want to cast a little bit of vision for what we're hoping for the Valley Church. We really just want to know what God is calling us to when it comes to our relationships and our marriages. We're hopeful. We're hoping to, and not letting grass grow under our feet, but to maybe once a month come together as married couples for maybe a small group. To come together and just spend some time looking at what God is wanting us to do, sharing, giving insight with one another, supporting one another. I'll give you out more information. If you have any ideas, I'm up for it. See me, see Rupert, Pastor Teddy, Pastor Mike. Just let us know if you have a vision for our marriages and just what you think that we can do for our church in this time in regards to our marriage. But one thing I do want to do before we are dismissed just for a second, I want to celebrate, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but I probably am. I want to celebrate Brooke and Travis. Can you tell me how long you guys have been married? Did I put you on the spot? I apologize. But it makes me happy that you are here. Almost 4 months, I know, right? Yeah, let's give them a hand. Fantastic. You know what? On the right road. I am so yes. And so we're glad that you guys are here. I just wanted to celebrate you too. So anyway, thank you all for coming. You're dismissed. Your kids are down the hall. If you have kids down the hall, they were fantastic. And we survived. It's okay. It's really okay. You all have a fantastic evening. And let's keep our church in prayer. Okay. Thank you, guys.